Sterling Rourke rode on to Copper Willow Land at 7 in the morning, which was early enough that most of the ranch hands were still pulling on their boots. He didn't knock. He rode straight to the front porch of the main house, stopped his horse 10 feet from the steps, and shouted loud enough that 3 men in the bunkhouse heard him through the wall. "Whitlock, send your daughter out. She needs to hear this from me before she hears it wrong from somebody else." Harlan Whitlock opened his front door with his coffee still in his hand. He was 61 years old and had spent 40 of those years building Copper Willow from raw Wyoming dirt, and nobody, not drought, not market crashes, not cattle sickness, had ever made him step backward on his own porch. He looked at Sterling Rourke sitting tall on that expensive black horse and said nothing. Sterling smiled like a man who already knew how the conversation ended. "I filed the water claim this morning. Silverhead Spring. My attorney in Cheyenne says territorial law is very clear." He let that settle for a moment. "You've got 30 days to negotiate or the courts decide. And Harlan, courts take a long time. Your cattle don't have that kind of patience. If you've ever felt the fury of watching a good man threatened by someone who has never earned a single thing he owns, stay with me." Subscribe to this channel and follow this story to its end, because what happens next will remind you exactly what kind of man wealth can never buy. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Sterling Rourke made his threat, Everett Shaw was 300 yards away, on his knees in the mud beside a water trough that had sprung a split along its bottom seam. He had discovered it before dawn during his first walk of the grounds. A habit nobody had asked him to develop and nobody paid him extra to maintain. He'd gone back to the tool shed, found a strip of tin, borrowed a mallet from the wall without waking anyone, and was in the process of hammering a patch over the crack when he heard Sterling's voice cut across the yard. He didn't stand up immediately. He listened. He heard Harlan's silence. He heard Sterling's smooth, practiced speech, the kind of tone that had clearly been rehearsed in front of a mirror until it sounded casual. And he heard the word courts, which landed in his chest like something cold. Everett set the mallet down in the mud and sat back on his heels. He'd been at Copper Willow for 3 years. He had arrived with a bedroll, a horse named Cutter, who was already 8 years old at the time, and a recommendation letter from a rancher in Montana who had sold his land and moved east. The recommendation said Everett was honest, capable, and quiet. It did not say he was ambitious. That was probably accurate. Everett had never spent much time imagining himself owning something like Copper Willow. It would have felt like imagining he could hold the Wyoming sky in his hands. Possible in theory, ridiculous in practice. What he had spent time imagining. And this was the thing that troubled him on cold nights when the bunkhouse went quiet and he lay awake staring at the ceiling planks, was Lenora Whitlock. Not in the way a man imagines a woman he intends to pursue. More in the way a man contemplates something he understands he cannot have, but cannot entirely stop thinking about either. She moved through the ranch like she had been built for it. Not decoratively, but functionally, the way a good fence post is built for the ground it stands in. She could read cattle the way experienced hands read weather. She could argue feed costs with the grain merchant in town and come out $3 ahead. She had opinions about everything from winter grazing rotation to the territorial legislature, and she stated them plainly, without softening them to make men more comfortable. Everett had watched her dress down a horse trader in Briar Hollow once for misrepresenting the age of a mare, and he had stood 20 feet back thinking very quietly that he had never in his life met anyone quite like her. He had also decided on that same afternoon that he was not going to do anything about it. He picked the mallet back up and finished the patch on the water trough. By the time he stood and wiped the mud from his knees, Sterling Rourke's horse was cantering back down the main road, and Harlan Whitlock was still standing on his porch, holding his coffee, looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who is doing arithmetic in his head and not liking the numbers. Everett's name in the bunkhouse was Shaw, sometimes just Shaw, occasionally Hey Shaw, if someone needed a hand quickly and didn't want to waste syllables. There were 11 other men working Copper Willow that season, a mix of permanent hands and seasonal workers who'd come up from Colorado following the cattle work north. Most of them were decent enough. A few were the kind of men who drifted from ranch to ranch for reasons they didn't discuss, which Everett understood without judging, because he'd spent 2 years drifting himself before he landed here. The one he'd grown closest to, and closest was a relative term among men who measured friendship in practical terms, was a hand named Del Pruitt. Del was 44, had a bad right knee that he wrapped every morning without complaint, and had worked cattle in 4 different territories. He had a gift for identifying trouble before it fully arrived, which made him valuable and also occasionally exhausting to spend time around. Dell found Everett at the water trough just as he was gathering his tools. "You heard that," Dell said. It wasn't a question. Hard not to. "Sterling Rourke." Dell said the name the way you'd name a weather system, descriptively without particular feeling. His father tried to buy Silverhead Spring from old Harlan about 12 years ago. Harlan told him the spring wasn't for sale because it kept his cattle alive in drought years, and without it, Copper Willow was just expensive dirt. His father backed off. Sterling isn't backing off. No. Dell squinted toward the main house. Sterling's smarter than his father was, or at least more patient. He's been building toward this for 2 years. Buying up small debts around the county, getting his man on the water board, filing paperwork. He paused. You file enough paperwork and people start believing whatever you filed is true. Everett said nothing. He set the mallet back on the tool shelf and hung the remaining tin strip on the wall peg. What do you think he'll do? Dell asked. I think he'll do exactly what he said he'd do. File the claim. Let the courts move slow and wait for the cattle to start dying from thirst before he offers Lenora a compromise that favors him completely. Dell was quiet for a moment. And if she doesn't take the compromise? Then he'll offer her something worse. I didn't see Lenora until nearly noon. She was coming out of the barn with her riding gloves still on and a look on her face that Everett recognized. Not anger exactly, more like the concentrated expression of someone who has decided to solve a problem by force of will before anything else fails. He'd seen it when a water pipe froze solid during the January storm and she'd organized the repair herself at 4 a.m. He'd seen it when 2 of the seasonal men got into a fight over wages and she'd stepped between them without raising her voice. He almost walked the other direction. Shaw. He stopped. She was looking at him directly, which she always did. No glancing sideways or studying the ground when she spoke to someone, which was either a family trait or something she'd trained herself into. Either way, it made you feel like she was paying attention to everything at once. You heard Sterling this morning. Yes, ma'am. Don't call me that. She had told him this before, more than once. Did you hear all of it or just part of it? All of it. She nodded slowly, pulling one glove off and working the other. He's not wrong about the territorial law. The statute he's citing is real. If someone files a claim on an unregistered water source and the current holder can't produce original survey records proving prior use, the courts can rule in the claimant's favor. Can you produce those records? She looked at him for a second in a way that was answer enough. My father had them, she said. We've had this spring since 1871. There are original survey stakes, but the records from the territory office they've had some organizational problems over the years, floods, a fire in 84. She said it flatly, without self-pity. We have the stakes. We have the spring. We don't have the paperwork to match. Where are the stakes? Up past the North Canyon rim, 3 of them, placed by the original survey crew. She paused. On Rourke's side of the argument, the distance from the spring to the actual stake markers is ambiguous enough that a territorial judge might rule either way. Everett turned this over. Who set the original boundary, the federal crew or the territorial one? She blinked. It was a small thing, but he noticed it. Federal. Why? Federal survey crews kept duplicate records, not with the territorial office, with the General Land Office in Washington. He'd learned this from a hand in Montana who'd once worked for a surveying company before he'd switched to cattle. They're harder to pull, but they exist. Lenora was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to notice. You know something about this. Not enough, but more than nothing. She looked at him, and this was the moment that made Everett feel the specific discomfort he always felt when she looked at him with that kind of precision, like she was reading something he hadn't intended to write on his face. I need to talk to my father, she said. Come to the main house at 6. Don't be late. She walked past him before he could answer. Harlan Whitlock was a large man who had become smaller without becoming less, which was the only way Everett knew to describe what illness had done to him over the past several months. He was still broad across the shoulders. His hands were still big and scarred and permanently shaped by decades of rope and tool work. But something had gone out of his movements, some certainty that had once made the man seem rooted to the earth the way an old tree is rooted. He was sitting in his study when Everett arrived, with a territorial map spread across the desk and a glass of water he wasn't drinking beside it. Lenora was already there, standing near the window. She had changed out of her riding clothes, which struck Everett as unusual for this hour, before he realized she'd probably done it to indicate to her father that she was taking the conversation seriously. "Shaw," Harlan said, not unkindly. "My daughter says you might know something useful." "I might know one direction to look, sir." "Sit down." Everett sat in the chair across from the desk. The chair was old and solid and had clearly been repaired at the joint twice, which he appreciated. A man who repairs things rather than replacing them was a man he understood. He told Harlan about the General Land Office records. He explained what he knew about duplicate surveying documentation, the way federal crews were required to file in 2 locations, the reason being exactly this kind of situation, where one record set might be lost or damaged or conveniently disappeared. Harlan listened with his hands flat on the desk. "The problem," Everett said, "is that pulling those records takes time. The request goes through a federal land agent, and the nearest one who handles this territory is in Laramie. Even if everything moves fast, you're looking at 3 to 4 weeks minimum. Sterling's 30-day window is going to close before that." "So we'd need something faster," Lenora said. "The original stakes," Everett said. "If we can find them, document their exact position, and produce that documentation at the hearing along with testimony from anyone who was present at the original survey." "That survey was 18 years ago," Harlan said. "Some of those men are still alive." Harlan looked at him steadily for a long moment. The clock on the mantel behind him made its small sounds. Outside, something moved through the dry grass. Probably a dog, probably nothing. "You'd have to ride into the canyon country to find the stakes," Harlan said. "That's 4 days out and 4 days back at minimum if nothing goes wrong. Going alone is not safe." "I know. And you'd be doing this for no additional pay. You're already drawing the lowest wage on this property." Everett felt something move through his chest. Not pride exactly, more like a thin irritation at the way the sentence was structured, as if his reason for going would naturally be financial. "Yes, sir. I know that too." Harlan studied him. "Why?" The question sat in the room. Everett had not prepared for it, which was probably why his answer was more honest than it should have been. "Because what Sterling's doing is wrong," he said, "and because I'm capable of doing something about it." He didn't look at Lenora when he said it. He kept his eyes on Harlan, which was safer and also correct. This wasn't about Lenora. He needed to believe that, and he needed the old man across the desk to believe it too. Harlan was quiet for a long time. "Del Pruitt goes with you," he finally said. "He knows that canyon better than most. You leave before sunrise day after tomorrow. I'll write you a document authorizing you to locate and photograph survey markers on Copper Willow land. That'll protect you legally if Rourke's people try to interfere." He opened the desk drawer and produced a piece of paper and a pen. "And Shaw?" "Sir?" "Don't come back without something I can use." The next morning, Everett was up before 4. He spent the hour before first light making sure his gear was right. Bedroll tied tight, food pack properly balanced, Cutter's shoes checked for looseness. He also spent some time writing out the measurements he already knew about the North Canyon terrain from 3 years of working the far pastures, organized them into rough notes, and tucked them in his front pocket. He was at the corral, adjusting Cutter's bridle in the dark, when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Lenora was standing 5 feet away in a heavy coat holding 2 cups. She extended one without speaking. He took it. Coffee. Black and hot enough that the steam rose visibly in the cold pre-dawn air. They stood in the dark for a moment, not saying anything, which was comfortable in a way that should not have been as comfortable as it was. "You don't have to do this," she said finally. "I know. My father's authorization helps, but if Rourke's men find you out there before you find the stakes, I'll handle it. You don't know what you'll be handling. Sterling has 3 full-time men who ride those canyons. He's been managing his eastern property line for 2 years. "I know." He took a sip of the coffee. It was very good. He didn't mention this. "Del knows the terrain. We'll move careful." She was quiet for a beat. "You told my father you're doing this because it's wrong and you can do something about it." He didn't respond. "That's not the only reason," she said. It wasn't a challenge. It was a statement offered carefully. The way you'd hand something fragile to someone. "Here, take this. I'm not throwing it." Everett kept his eyes on Cutter. The horse was breathing slow, still half asleep, his sides moving in and out in the dark. Miss Whitlock, Lenora. Lenora. The name felt different to say than he expected. Not harder, different. "Whatever reasons I might have for things I do, they don't affect the rightness or wrongness of the thing I'm doing." She considered this. "That's a very careful answer," she said. "It's the best I have." She didn't push further. She watched him finish adjusting the bridle in the dark, and when he'd finished, she took both cups and walked back to the main house without another word. He watched her go. Cutter turned his head and gave Everett the slow, patient look of an animal that had witnessed too many things to be surprised by human behavior. "Don't," Everett said. Dell arrived at the corral at 4:10, slightly later than agreed, with his bad knee already wrapped and his expression indicating he had come to terms with the situation overnight and was now committed to it without enthusiasm. "Cold," Dell said. "Yes." "Going to get colder up in the canyon?" "Yes." Dell looked at Cutter and then at his own horse, a gray quarter horse named Brick, who was roughly twice the personality of his owner. "You told Harlan 3 days out minimum. I think you're optimistic." "I probably am. The North Rim markers, if they're still standing, and that's not guaranteed, Shaw, 18 years of Wyoming weather does considerable damage to wooden posts. They're up on the sandstone shelf above the second canyon fork. You need to go around the long way because the short approach crosses onto Black Mesa land. How long is the long way? Adds about a day." Everett absorbed this. "We still go." Dell shrugged, which was as close as he came to agreement. They rode out into the dark with the stars still overhead and the first edge of morning not yet visible to the east. The ranch settled behind them. The roofline of the main house, the dark bulk of the barn, the small orange square of the bunkhouse window where someone was already awake. Everett didn't look back. They pushed hard the first day and covered more ground than Dell had expected, which improved his mood slightly. The terrain north of Copper Willow's main pastures was rough and increasingly broken as they moved toward the canyon country, scrub pines starting to appear on the ridges, the ground shifting from dry grassland to the pale sandy soil that indicated they were moving into the sandstone formations. They camped that night on a shelf above a dry creek bed, a fire small enough to give off heat without announcing itself, and ate what they'd packed without much conversation. Dell broke the silence around the time the fire had burned down to coals. "You going to tell me the real reason you're out here?" he said. Everett stared at the coals. I told Harlan. I know what you told Harlan. I'm asking what you're telling yourself." Everett was quiet for a while. "Lenora Whitlock is going to lose her ranch if someone doesn't do something," he finally said, "and I'm the one who thought of something to do." Dell was quiet. "That's it?" he asked. "That's most of it. Shaw," Dell said, in the tone of someone who has lived 44 years and is done being polite about obvious things. "You've worked that ranch for 3 years. You've given up wages for injured hands and stayed late on work. Nobody assigned you and managed to convince every man in the bunkhouse that you just happen to be nearby whenever something needs doing. You're not subtle about what kind of man you are." Everett said nothing. "She's worth caring about," Dell said. "Not cruelly, just plainly." "But caring about someone and deserving them are 2 different arguments." "I know that." "Do you?" Everett turned his cup in his hands. The metal was warm from the fire. "She deserves somebody who can offer her something. And what exactly is it you think she doesn't have enough of? Land, cattle, money? A name? Stability. The kind of future that doesn't depend on the lowest paid cowboy on the property riding into canyon country and hoping he finds an 18-year-old fence stake before Sterling Rourke's men find him first." Dell didn't respond to that. After a moment, he said, "Get some sleep. We've got a long day ahead." They found the first marker on the 3rd morning. It was a corner post, original timber, square cut, set into a stone cairn that someone had built around its base to help it stand. The cairn was what had preserved it. The wood above the stones was weathered gray and soft in places, but the post itself had not fallen, and carved into the face of it, still visible under 70 years of Wyoming wind, were markings, survey notations, a territorial boundary number, and a date. 1871. Everett dismounted and crouched beside it for a long moment. "There it is," Dell said quietly, from horseback. Everett pulled out the measurement rope he'd brought and began working. Distance to the creek bed, distance to the visible rock formation to the north, compass bearing. He recorded everything in the small leather notebook he'd put in his coat pocket the morning they left. It took nearly an hour to document the first stake properly. 2 more to find, Dell said. "I know, but this one's real." Everett looked at the carved numbers. "This proves the survey crew came out here? It proves the original line." "It's 1 corner," Dell said, not unkindly. "You need all 3 to draw the line. Then let's find the others." They rode deeper into the canyon. The second stake was gone. Not fallen. Gone. The stone cairn was there. The ring of rocks, the packed earth in the center. but the post itself had been removed. Recently. The disturbed soil around the base was still loose enough that Everett could work his fingers into it. Dell was studying the ground around the cairn with an expression that had moved past concern into something quieter and more specific. "Somebody pulled it," he said. "Yes." "That's not weather." Dell looked up at the canyon walls. "Shaw, I see it. 3 men on horseback, on the rim above them, too far up to make out faces clearly, but close enough to make out the black mesa brand on the nearest horse." Everett stood up slowly and kept his hands visible. One of the riders descended the trail that switched back down the canyon wall. The other 2 stayed on the rim, watching. The rider who came down was maybe 30 years old, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been in enough confrontations to stop expecting them to resolve peacefully. He stopped his horse 15 feet from Everett. "You're on Rourke land," he said. "I'm not," Everett said. He pulled out Harlan's authorization document and held it up. "I'm on Copper Willow survey land, acting under written authorization from the property holder." The man didn't look at the document. "Mr. Rourke filed a water claim this week. Territorial law says that access to disputed boundaries is restricted pending legal resolution." "Territorial law says nothing of the kind." Everett kept his voice level. "You'd know that if you'd read it." The man's jaw tightened. "Come down off this property, friend, now, before this gets complicated." Dell, from his horse, said nothing. But Everett noticed his right hand had dropped to his side in the casual way that meant he was paying attention to where it might need to be. "We're documenting survey markers," Everett said. "That's within our legal rights, regardless of any pending claim. If Mr. Rourke has a problem with that, his attorney can file a separate motion. Until then, I'm finishing what I came to do." A long moment. The man on horseback looked at Everett the way men look at situations they hadn't expected to be complicated and are now reconsidering. Then he turned his horse and rode back up the switchback. The 2 men on the rim watched for another minute, then disappeared over the canyon edge. Dell let out a long, slow breath. "That went better than it should have." "For now," Everett said. He turned back to the empty cairn and wrote in his notebook. "Second stake location confirmed. Post removed. Soil disturbance consistent with recent extraction." Then he documented the measurements anyway. Cairn to creek, cairn to the north formation, compass bearing. Because the cairn itself was evidence. The absence of the post was evidence too, just not the kind that was easy to use. "We need to find the 3rd one," Everett said. "Before they go find it first," Dell said. "Yes." They rode harder after that. The 3rd stake was 2 miles northeast, on a sandstone shelf that required them to leave the horses and climb on foot for 40 minutes through terrain that was easy enough to twist an ankle on if you moved carelessly. Everett moved carefully. They found it standing. It was in worse condition than the first. The wood had split vertically, and the top half had folded to the side so it was leaning rather than upright. But it was there, and the survey markings on its face were legible if you looked at them in good light with the right angle. Everett documented everything, every measurement, every notation. He recorded the condition of the wood, the split, the lean angle, the compass bearing to the first stake as best he could calculate it. Dell stood watch on the upper ledge above him for the entire hour it took. When Everett had finished, he sat back on the sandstone and looked out across the canyon country. The light had moved into late afternoon. The walls of the canyon had turned from pale tan to a darker orange red. They were going to have to make camp again tonight. They would not make it back to Copper Willow before tomorrow at the earliest. "You think what you've got is enough?" Dell called down. Everett looked at his notebook. "It's enough to prove the original survey happened and where the line ran. But Sterling's attorney is going to argue that the missing 2nd stake breaks the documented chain." He paused. "I need testimony from someone who was present at the original survey." "That was 18 years ago," Dell said. "Same problem Harlan had. One of those survey crew members might still be alive." Everett thought of the man from Montana who had told him about duplicate federal records. A man who'd spent years in surveying before cattle. "And I think I know where to start looking." Dell was quiet for a moment. "That's another week's worth of riding, Shaw. Maybe more." "I know." "Harlan gave you authorization to find the stakes, not to run halfway across the territory chasing down retired surveyors." "I know that too." Dell climbed down carefully to Everett's level, favoring his bad knee on the steeper sections. He stood on the ledge beside Everett and looked out at the canyon the same way Everett had been looking at it. "You'd be doing this on your own time," Dell said. "Your own provisions. No pay." "Yes." "Lenora's going to argue with you about it." "She can argue all she wants." Dell looked at him sideways. "What?" Everett said. "Nothing," Dell said. "Let's get down before the light goes." They reached Copper Willow the following evening, arriving well after dark to find the main house still lit, and Harlan sitting on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in a heavy coat that had clearly been his for 20 years based on its condition. Everett gave him the notebook first. Harlan sat with it in the lamplight for a long while, turning through the pages slowly. When he reached the section about the missing stake and the 3 Black Mesa riders, his expression didn't change, which Everett had learned was different from having no reaction. It was the expression of a man who was absorbing information and rearranging his understanding of a situation. "They got to the second one," Harlan said. "Yes, but the cairn is documented, the location is documented, and the other 2 stakes are standing." Everett paused. "I think I can find someone who was on the original survey crew. It would take time, and You'd need to leave again," Harlan said. "Yes, sir." Harlan looked at the notebook for another moment. Then he looked up at Everett with an expression that was difficult to categorize. Not warm exactly, but something adjacent to warm. Evaluating, maybe. The way a man looks at a horse he's thinking about trusting. "Where?" he asked. "A town called Garnet Junction, about 60 miles east. There was a federal survey contractor working out of there in the early 1870s. I have a name." Harlan nodded slowly. "Take what you need from the provisions room. Leave tomorrow if you want." He handed the notebook back. "But Shaw, if you find this man and he's willing to testify, you bring him back intact. Don't let him commit to anything before the formal hearing. Sterling's attorney will look for any inconsistency to discredit him." "Understood." Lenora appeared in the doorway behind Harlan's chair. She had clearly been listening through the screen. She was looking at Everett with the expression he had seen before and could not entirely read, the one that was not quite gratitude and not quite something else, but lived in the territory between them. Everett picked up his notebook. "Good night, sir," he said to Harlan. He nodded briefly at Lenora, who said nothing. He walked back across the yard toward the bunkhouse, and if he was aware of her watching him go, he kept that awareness carefully out of his posture. The stars were very sharp and very cold overhead. Somewhere to the east, 60 miles, maybe a little more, there was an aging man who might remember a spring and a boundary line from nearly 2 decades ago. Everett planned to be riding before 4. Garnet Junction was the kind of town that had been almost something once and then stopped trying. There were 2 streets that crossed each other at a right angle, a grain merchant, a livery, a post office that shared its building with a hardware store, and a saloon that had survived 3 different owners by being the only place in 40 miles that served hot food after 6 in the evening. The buildings were real enough, solid timber and some brick near the center. But the whole place had the quality of a man sitting down for a rest that had gone on too long. Everett rode in on a Tuesday morning alone, having left Cutter at the livery in the first block and walked the rest of the way on foot because he wanted to get a sense of the town before the town got a sense of him. The name he was looking for was Amos Teal. He had gotten it from a note in his Montana contact's memory, not written anywhere, just recalled. A man named Teal who had worked federal survey contracts in Wyoming Territory through the early 1870s, meticulous, older even then, who had retired to someplace east of Copper Willow country. Garnet Junction had come up in the same conversation as an afterthought, the kind of detail that lodges in the brain without explanation. Everett hoped the detail was accurate. He had ridden 62 miles on the strength of it. He tried the post office first, which was logical. The postmaster was a thin woman in her 50s with ink on 3 fingers who looked at him over her spectacles with the practiced assessment of someone who sorted people the same way she sorted mail, quickly, without sentiment. "Teal," she said. "Amos Teal. Yes, he's here. Has been for about 6 years." She studied Everett's road dust and the worn state of his coat. "He doesn't get many visitors." "I'm not visiting socially," Everett said. "I need to talk with him about survey work he did in 71. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmer exactly, but less guarded. "He lives on the east edge of town, the house with the green door. It used to be a brighter green." Everett thanked her and left. The house was easy to find. The door had once been the particular bright green of new paint applied with optimism, and was now the dull, flaking green of a thing that had weathered past its original intention. The yard was not neglected, but not tended either. Somewhere in the middle, like a man who knew things needed doing, but had stopped being urgent about when. He knocked. The man who opened the door was somewhere between 70 and 80, with the kind of face that had spent decades outdoors. Deeply lined, not unpleasant, with eyes that were still sharp in a way that suggested his mind had not followed his body into its various complaints. He was maybe 5'8" and had been taller once. You could tell by how he held his shoulders. He looked at Everett without speaking. Mr. Teal, my name is Everett Shaw. I work for Copper Willow Ranch, outside Briar Hollow. I rode out here because I believe you did federal survey work in that territory in 1871, and I need to ask you some questions about it. Amos Teal looked at him for a long moment. You rode 60 miles, he said. 62. For a survey from 18 years ago. Yes, sir. Teal considered this with the slowness of a man who made decisions based on something other than urgency. Then he stepped back from the door. Come in, I'll put coffee on. It's going to take you a while to explain what you're actually asking, so you might as well be warm while you do it. The inside of the house was the opposite of its exterior. Organized, functional, with the careful order of a man who had spent years working in conditions where disorganization cost you. Survey instruments on a dedicated shelf. Maps rolled and labeled in a wooden rack. Books arranged by subject. A drafting table near the window with better light than any other spot in the room. Teal moved to the stove without rushing. Everett sat at the table and did not look around too obviously, though he noticed everything. Copper Willow, Teal said with his back turned. Harlan Whitlock's place. You know it. I surveyed it. A brief pause. Well, I surveyed the spring boundary. That was the specific job. Silverhead Spring. The Whitlock claim went in through federal channels. Harlan's father. Actually, it was before Harlan fully took over. And the General Land Office sent us out to establish the eastern boundary of the water source claim. He set 2 cups on the table and sat across from Everett with the ease of a man who spent a lot of time alone and was not uncomfortable with company, but also did not require it. 3 stakes, North Canyon Rim. I found 2 of them, Everett said. Teal looked at him. And the third? Gone. Pulled out. Recently. The old man was quiet for a moment. How recently? Within the last week, I'd estimate, based on the soil disturbance around the cairn. Teal wrapped both hands around his cup. He had large hands for his size, the hands of a man who had worked with tools and rope and equipment for decades, and which had stiffened somewhat at the joints without losing their fundamental capability. Someone pulled a federal survey stake, he said. Not a question. More like a man reading a sentence aloud to make sure he understood it correctly. Rourke, Everett said. Sterling Rourke, neighboring ranch. He filed a water claim on Silverhead Spring 3 weeks ago. He's arguing the spring's boundary isn't properly documented. It's documented, Teal said, with the flatness of a man who had done the documentation himself and took exception to its accuracy being questioned. Not in the territorial office. The records there are incomplete. Fire in '84 took some of it. The federal records take 3 to 4 weeks to pull through the land office in Laramie. The hearing is in less than 2. Everett set his notebook on the table. I need testimony from someone who was present at the original survey. Someone who can state under oath where those stakes were placed and what the boundary markers documented. Teal looked at the notebook without touching it. His expression had moved into something careful, not reluctant, but aware of weight. You're asking me to appear at a territorial water rights hearing. Yes, sir. I'm 73 years old, Shaw. My hip has been bad for 2 years. 62 miles is not a short ride. I know. And Rourke's attorney, whoever he's hired, is going to do his best to make an old man's memory look unreliable. I know that too. Teal looked at Everett directly. What's your stake in this? You said you work the ranch. You're not family. It was the same question Harlan had asked, with different words. Everett gave the same answer he'd given before because it was still the truest one he had. What's being done is wrong. I'm in a position to do something about it. That's a short answer for a long ride. It's the honest one. Teal picked up the notebook and opened it. He looked through the measurements Everett had recorded at the first stake, and the documentation of the empty cairn where the second had been, and the notes from the third stake on the sandstone shelf. He read carefully and without comment for several minutes. His coffee went from hot to warm and he didn't notice. When he set the notebook down, he said, Your measurements are good. You did this right. I tried to. The cairn documentation for the missing stake, that's smart. The cairn itself is evidence of the original survey. It doesn't prove where the post was exactly, but it proves the survey crew was there and placed something. I need that third stake's position on the record, Everett said, and I need someone who can speak to what was in the original field notes. I kept copies, Teal said. Everett stopped. Of all my federal survey work, Teal said, with the mild tone of a man stating something obvious, I kept personal copies. The land office has theirs, but a surveyor who doesn't keep his own records is a surveyor who can't defend his own work. He looked at Everett. I have the 1871 field notes for the Silverhead Spring Boundary Survey in that cabinet behind you. Everett turned and looked at the filing cabinet. 4 drawers, labeled on small, handwritten cards in careful script. He turned back. You have the original field notes. My copies. Same data. Mr. Teal. Everett took a breath. That changes things considerably. I imagine it does. Teal picked up his coffee, found it had cooled, and set it down again without complaint. I'll need 2 days to get my things in order. My neighbor's boy can look after the house. And I'll need a horse. Mine isn't reliable anymore for long distances. Copper Willow can provide one. Teal nodded slowly. I want to be clear about something, Shaw. I'm not going to that hearing to do Harlan Whitlock a favor. I'm going because someone removed a federal survey stake, and that is an offense against the accuracy of the public record, and I find that personally objectionable. He paused. But I suppose the result is the same either way. It is, Everett said. All right then. Teal pushed back his chair. I'll heat the coffee back up. You look like you haven't slept properly in 3 days. 4, Everett said. Right. Sit still. They rode back toward Briar Hollow on Thursday morning, Teal on a borrowed ranch horse that was steadier than his own, Everett on Cutter, and the field notes wrapped in oilcloth and tucked inside Teal's saddlebag with the care of a man transporting something irreplaceable, which they were. The old surveyor rode slower than Everett would have preferred, not because of any complaint. Teal didn't complain, but because the hip made certain gaits difficult for extended periods, and Everett was not willing to risk arriving with a witness who couldn't walk into a hearing room. They camped 2 nights on the road, which gave Everett more time than he'd had in weeks to think without doing anything else simultaneously. He thought about the hearing. He organized the evidence in his head the way he organized gear, what was solid, what was fragile, what needed to be handled with extra care. The field notes were solid. His measurement documentation was solid. Teal's testimony was solid, assuming Sterling's attorney didn't find a way to make it look otherwise. The missing stake was the problem. The missing stake would be the first thing Sterling's attorney pointed at. Someone removed that post, and Sterling's men would argue the most obvious interpretation, that Everett himself had removed it, or that it had never been there, and that the cairn was coincidental or misidentified. He needed something to counter that. On the second evening, sitting across a small fire from Teal, he said, if someone at the hearing argues the second stake was never placed, that the cairn is a natural rock formation or a hunter's marker, what would your field notes show? Teal had been looking at the fire with the restful quality of a man who had sat beside enough of them to find them reliably companionable. The field notes show 3 stakes, he said, with coordinates, measurements, and materials notations. The stakes were split pine, 12 inches square, treated with linseed oil. Distinctive. He looked at Everett. Also, I have a sketch. A sketch. I sketched all 3 cairn placements. It was not required by the land office, but I found it useful for reference. I sketched the stone arrangement, the terrain features, the sight lines to natural landmarks. He paused. The sketch for the second stake shows a particular rock formation, a double-arch sandstone, very distinctive, about 30 yards southeast of the cairn position. If that formation still exists, it does, Everett said. He had noted it. It was in his documentation, described as a reference landmark. I measured from it. Teal looked at him with an expression that was the closest thing to approval Everett had seen from him. Then we can demonstrate, using the sketch and your measurements, that the cairn you documented is the same cairn I placed the stake in. The rock formation doesn't move. Everett sat with this for a moment. It was not ironclad. A good attorney could still argue the sketch was self-serving, that the formation was less distinctive than claimed, that the measurements didn't hold up to scrutiny. But it was real. It was documented. It made the argument for the stake's original placement considerably harder to dismiss. Sterling's men were watching us when we found the empty cairn, Everett said. They had time to get there ahead of us, which means someone told them we were looking. Someone at the ranch? Maybe. Or Rourke had someone watching the access roads. Everett fed a stick into the fire. Either way, they knew we were coming and they moved to remove evidence before we could document it. That's not the action of someone who believes the law is on his side. No, Teal agreed. It's the action of someone who believes power is on his side. Those are different things. They sat with the fire for a while longer. You've done this before, Teal said eventually. Not the riding. the thinking, the assembling of pieces. Not formally, Everett said. Where'd you learn it? Everett thought about the question. From watching what happens when nobody does it, he said. You see enough situations where the wrong person wins because the right person didn't organize their case. You start paying attention to what the difference is. Teal nodded, as if this answer satisfied something he'd been evaluating. The wrong person wins too often, he said, even with good evidence, because good evidence doesn't organize itself and doesn't walk itself into a hearing room. No, Everett said, it needs someone to carry it. They arrived at Copper Willow late on a Friday afternoon, and the state of things there told Everett immediately that something had happened in his absence. 3 horses he didn't recognize were tied at the post near the main house. 2 of the regular hands were standing near the barn in the deliberate way men stand when they're trying to look like they're not paying attention to something, which meant they were paying close attention to something. And Lenora was on the porch with her arms crossed and a posture that Everett, in 3 years of observation, had learned to associate with controlled fury. He got Teal settled with water and a seat in the shade before he went to find out what had happened. Dell intercepted him at the edge of the yard. Sterling came himself, Dell said quietly. Yesterday. Brought his attorney and 2 witnesses. To do what? To serve papers. Dell's jaw worked. He's amended the territorial claim. He's added a new argument that Copper Willow owes Black Mesa Ranch a water-use debt going back to 1882. He's produced a document, apparently signed by Harlan, granting Black Mesa limited seasonal use of Silverhead Spring in exchange for emergency grazing rights during a drought year. Everett stared at him. That document is real? He asked. Harlan says it's real. The signature is his, but he says the agreement was a 1-season arrangement explicitly temporary and was never intended as a permanent water use grant. Dell looked uncomfortable. Sterling's attorney is arguing it constitutes an ongoing legal right to water access, which combined with the boundary claim creates a situation where Copper Willow potentially owes Black Mesa both access and back compensation. That's... Everett stopped himself. How much? Enough to bankrupt the ranch if the court rules in Sterling's favor on both counts. Everett absorbed this. It was more sophisticated than he'd expected. Not just a boundary dispute. A 2-pronged attack, boundary claim and debt claim, designed so that even if one failed, the other might succeed, and together they created enough legal complexity to exhaust Copper Willow's resources fighting them. Where's Harlan? Inside. He's not well. The visit yesterday... Dell hesitated. The attorney was not kind to him. Sterling let his man talk to Harlan like an old fool who'd signed something he didn't understand. Harlan didn't take it well. He was up most of the night. Everett looked at the porch where Lenora was still standing, watching him come across the yard. He walked to her. You found what you needed? She said. Yes, and more than I expected. He looked at her directly. Dell told me about the debt claim. Something crossed her face. Not weakness, more like the expression of a person who has been holding something up for a long time and knows they have to keep holding it regardless of how heavy it is. It changes the shape of the problem, she said. It does, but it doesn't change the evidence. Sterling's attorney is going to argue in front of that hearing that my father is a confused old man who signed agreements he didn't understand and now can't account for his own ranch's legal history. Her voice was even, carefully even. That's what this second claim is designed to do, not just take the water, discredit my father publicly so that everything he says about Copper Willow's history becomes questionable. Everett had not thought of it that way. I did now, and it made the construction of Sterling's strategy considerably clearer and considerably more calculated. Who are the 3 horses? He asked. My father's attorney came from Cheyenne this morning, and 2 men I don't know. My father asked them to come. He hasn't explained why. She paused. He wants to see you, both of you. You and whoever you brought back. His name is Amos Teal. He surveyed the spring in 1871, and he has his original field notes. Lenora looked at him steadily for a moment. You actually found him. I said I would. You said you'd try. Same thing, Everett said. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Not quite not. Go see my father, she said. He needs good news more than anything else right now. Harlan looked worse than when Everett had left. Not dramatically worse. Not the kind of worse that announces itself, but the kind of worse that accumulates in increments over days when a man is under sustained pressure without adequate rest. His color was not good. He was moving more carefully than before, with the slight hesitation of someone managing discomfort they haven't mentioned to anyone. But when Teal walked into the room behind Everett and introduced himself, Harlan straightened in his chair with something that was very close to the old solidity. "Amos Teal," Harlan said. "You surveyed this spring." "I did." Teal sat across from him without waiting to be invited. "I have the field notes, all 3 stakes, measurements, coordinates, and sketches." He looked at Harlan directly. "Your spring boundary was properly established. There is no legitimate question about where the line falls." Harlan looked at Teal for a long moment. Then he looked at Everett. "You went 60 miles and brought back the man who did the original survey," he said. 62, Everett said. Harlan was quiet. His attorney, a compact man in his 40s named Briggs, who had arrived from Cheyenne with a briefcase and the expression of someone who dealt professionally with bad situations, leaned forward. "Mr. Teal, I need to review those field notes tonight. The hearing is in 9 days, and we need to build the presentation around what's in them." "They're in my bag," Teal said. "I'll get them." As Teal left the room, Briggs turned to Everett. "The debt claim," he said, without preamble. "Sterling is using a document that is technically valid, but being applied in a way that contradicts its original intent. The problem is that intent is difficult to prove without supporting documentation from the time of signing." "Is there any?" Everett asked. "We're looking," Briggs said, "but Harlan's records from that period are incomplete." Harlan made a sound that was somewhere between a cough and a laugh. "I was never a paperwork man," he said. "I built this ranch with my hands, not my pen." "I understand," Briggs said, with the practiced patience of a man who had dealt with clients who were excellent at their work and poor at its documentation. "But the court won't care how the ranch was built. The court will care what the paper says." "What did Sterling give you as evidence for the debt claim?" Everett asked. "The original document. 2 witnesses who claimed to have been present when it was signed." Briggs's expression indicated he did not place great confidence in these witnesses. "And an argument that the 1882 drought year agreement constitutes precedent for ongoing access." "It doesn't. An emergency arrangement between 2 neighbors during a drought is not a permanent water right." Everett thought. "Does anyone else remember the 1882 season? Any of the currents? Who were here then?" "Del Pruitt," Harlan said immediately. "Del was here in 82. He was a junior hand then." Everett felt something click into place. "Del was present when the arrangement was made?" "He would have been on the property. Whether he saw the document signed," Harlan shook his head. "I don't remember who was in the room." "I'll talk to him tonight," Everett said. He looked at the 2 men Harlan had brought in who had not yet been introduced. They were sitting to the side. One appeared to be in his mid-50s with the quiet watchfulness of someone who spent his professional life in courtrooms, and the other was younger, maybe 35, with ink-stained fingers. "Who are they?" Everett asked. Harlan looked at the 2 men briefly. "Friends," he said, "from the Territorial Cattle Association, men who know Sterling Rourke's business practices from other dealings. I asked them to come because I thought their knowledge might be useful." The older of the 2 men nodded at Everett. "Marcus Feld," he said. "I had a boundary dispute with Rourke 2 years ago. Different spring, same tactic, manufactured documentation, convenient witnesses." He withdrew the claim before it got to a hearing. Why? Because he found a faster way to get what he wanted. He bought the rancher out. Feld's voice was flat and factual. The rancher needed money and Rourke was convenient. But the original claim, the documents he filed, were questioned by the other party's attorney, and Rourke backed down rather than have them scrutinized in a public hearing. "The documents were fraudulent," Everett said. "That was the implication, yes." "Who was the attorney who questioned them?" "A man named Halsey in Laramie." Everett looked at Briggs. Briggs was already writing something down. "This is a pattern," Everett said. "Sterling uses manufactured documentation as a first approach. If it holds up, he wins. If it's challenged seriously, he finds another way. He's never had his documents examined at a formal public hearing." "No," Feld agreed. "He hasn't. Because the ranchers he goes after don't have the resources to mount a serious defense." Everett stood. I was suddenly aware of the room. The lamplight, the faces, the accumulated weight of the problem arranged around Harlan's desk. That's what he's counting on here. That Copper Willow is too financially stretched, too legally inexperienced, and too concerned with Harlan's health to fight him properly. He looked at Harlan. "We're going to fight him properly," he said. Harlan looked back at him. "I know," he said. Dell was in the bunkhouse when Everett found him, sitting on the edge of his bunk with his knee unwrapped and a cloth and oil working on his saddle leather. The other hands were either asleep or out, and the room had the quiet, specific quality of late evening. "Tell me about 1882, Everett said. Dell didn't look up from the saddle. "Dry year. Worst drought in a decade out here. Several ranches nearly lost their herds." "The agreement between Harlan and Black Mesa. Harlan let them use the spring for 6 weeks during the worst of it," Dell said. "Late summer. The grass was burning off, the creeks were gone, Black Mesa cattle were starting to lose condition." He paused his work. "Harlan did it because you don't watch your neighbor's cattle die if you can stop it, not because he owed them anything." "Was it written down?" "Harlan wrote something. He wasn't big on paperwork, but he wanted it understood that the arrangement was temporary, so he made both parties sign a paper that said so." Everett sat on the bunk across from him. "Were you there when it was signed?" Dell was quiet for a moment. "I was outside the room," he said carefully. "I heard them talking." Harlan read the document out loud before they signed it, the way he did with everything. He always read agreements out loud in front of witnesses. Said it prevented misunderstanding. "What did he read?" Dell set the saddlecloth down. He read that Black Mesa was granted emergency access to Silverhead Spring for 1 season, to end on the 1st of September, 1882, and that this access created no ongoing right to water use and could not be used as precedent for future claims. He said it like a man reciting something he had heard clearly enough once that it had stayed. Those words exactly. I was standing on the other side of the door. "Dell." Everett leaned forward. "You need to say that at the hearing." "I know. Sterling's witnesses are going to say the agreement was open-ended. You're going to say the opposite." "I'm aware of what that means," Dell said. He picked the cloth back up. "Sterling will spend money trying to make me look like a confused old cowboy with a grudge. You're 44. "I know how old I am, Shaw." He worked the oil into the leather in slow, even circles. "I also know what I heard. And I know that a man who removes survey stakes in the middle of the night and then sends his attorney to imply that a sick old rancher doesn't understand his own documents." He stopped. "That man doesn't deserve the benefit of anything." Everett said nothing. "I'll testify," Dell said. "Stop looking at me like I'm going to change my mind." "I wasn't sure." "You were very sure. You just didn't want to assume." Dell glanced up briefly. "Which is one of the things that makes you tolerable to work with, for what it's worth." Everett stood. "Get some sleep. Briggs is going to want to talk to you tomorrow." "Who?" "Harlan's attorney." Dell made a sound of mild resignation. "Of course there's an attorney." He went back to his saddle. Everett went back out into the night, where the stars were the kind of cold and clear that Wyoming produced in late season, the kind that seemed entirely indifferent to whatever was happening underneath them, which was probably the honest truth of it. 9 days until the hearing. He had a surveyor with field notes. He had a witness who remembered what was actually said in 1882. He had a pattern of fraudulent documentation from another dispute. He had his own measurements and the documentation of a missing stake that had been deliberately removed. It was more than he'd had a week ago. It was not everything. There were pieces still missing. Most critically, something that directly implicated Sterling in the removal of the stake, not just circumstantially, but specifically. The presence of Black Mesa riders in the canyon was suggestive. It was not proof. He stood in the yard for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the main house. One window was still lit upstairs. Lenora's probably, or possibly Harlan's. He needed one more piece. The problem was he didn't know yet what it was or where it was, and 9 days was not a long time to find something he couldn't describe. He walked back to the bunkhouse, pulled off his boots, and was asleep in 4 minutes. The piece Everett needed walked into the Copper Willow yard on a Monday morning, 6 days before the hearing, in the form of a man named Curtis Boyle. Everett was at the corral working Cutter through a basic exercise. The horse had gone stiff from the hard riding and needed to move properly before his muscles locked into bad habits. When he heard the gate latch and turned to see a man he didn't recognize coming across the yard with the specific walk of someone who has made a decision and is getting it done before he loses his nerve. Medium height, somewhere in his mid-30s, with a face that had not slept well recently. He was dressed like a working hand, but his boots were Black Mesa quality, which was to say better than working hands usually bought for themselves. Everett stopped Cutter and watched him come. The man stopped at the fence. "I'm looking for whoever's in charge of the water claim defense," he said. "Why?" The man looked at him. Because I was one of the 3 men on the canyon rim when you documented those stakes. Everett held very still. My name is Curtis Boyle, the man said. I've worked Black Mesa for 4 years. I was there when the foreman told us to go out and pull that second stake. He stopped. His jaw worked briefly like he was chewing on the next part. I didn't pull it myself. That was Garver, the foreman. But I was there. I watched him do it, and I helped cover the marks in the soil after. The corral was very quiet. Cutter made a small sound and shifted his weight. Why are you here? Everett said. Because Garver told me last week that if this hearing goes wrong for Rourke, the story is going to be that I pulled the stake. Not him, me. Boyle's voice was flat with the particular flatness of someone who has been angry for days and is now past the loud part of it into something colder. I've got a wife and a girl in Briar Hollow. I'm not going to lose everything because Garver decides I'm a convenient person to blame. Everett tied Cutter's lead to the fence post and came around the corral gate. Come to the main house, he said. Briggs talked to Curtis Boyle for 2 hours. Everett sat in the corner of the room and said almost nothing, because it was not his conversation to lead, and he understood that. Briggs was good, methodical and patient, asking the same questions in different configurations to make sure the answers held their shape. Lenora sat across the room with a notepad and wrote things down, not looking at Boyle when he was speaking, which put him more at ease than direct attention would have. Harlan was not present. He was resting, which was something he did more of now and which nobody commented on because commenting on it would have required acknowledging something none of them were ready to formally acknowledge. What Boyle knew was specific and damaging. 3 days before Everett and Dell had ridden into the canyon, Rourke's foreman, a man named Garver who had worked Black Mesa for 8 years and was known to do what Sterling required without requiring explanations, had gathered 4 men and ridden to the survey site. Boyle had assumed it was a routine patrol of the eastern property line. He had not been told about the stake until Garver dismounted at the cairn and began working the post out of the ground with a crowbar. I asked him what he was doing, Boyle said. He told me it was a property matter and to stay out of it. And you stayed out of it, Briggs said, neutral, not accusatory. I was on a horse 50 feet away, Boyle said. Garver had 3 other men with him who were not the type to argue with, and he stopped. I told myself it was Rourke's land and Rourke's business. But it wasn't Rourke's land, Briggs said. No, I knew that. Boyle's hands on the table were still. I knew it when he did it. And you helped cover the soil disturbance. Yes. What exactly did you do? Packed the loose dirt back into the cairn, raked the surface flat, scattered some dead leaves. He said it without flinching, which Everett noted. Not because it made Boyle admirable, but because it suggested the man was done with the version of events where he minimized his involvement. Where is the stake now? Briggs asked. I don't know exactly. Garver took it with us when we rode out. He said he'd deal with it. Boyle paused. But I know which direction we rode, and I know Garver's habits. Briggs looked at Everett. Everett said, There's an old mine shaft on the eastern edge of Black Mesa Range, 2 miles north of the property boundary. Garver's used it before. Ranch hands talk. If the stake is in that shaft, Briggs said carefully, and we can retrieve it, you'd need access to Black Mesa land, Lenora said, which we don't have. Not officially, Everett said. Shaw. Lenora's voice was even. I am not asking anyone to trespass on Rourke's property. I'm not suggesting trespassing, Everett said. I'm suggesting that if the Territorial Sheriff's Office were made aware that a federal survey stake, a federal marker, not a territorial one, had potentially been removed and disposed of on private land, they would have grounds to conduct their own investigation. Briggs set down his pen. He looked at Everett for a moment with an expression that indicated he was reassessing something. A federal marker, Briggs said. The stakes were placed by a federal survey crew, Teal said from the doorway. Nobody had noticed him arrive. The old man had a habit of appearing in rooms without making noise about it, commissioned by the General Land Office, which makes them federal property. Removing or destroying them is a federal offense, separate from any territorial water claim. Briggs was quiet for a moment. If we file a report with the Territorial Marshal's Office citing potential destruction of federal property, and if we can give them specific enough information about the location, they have grounds to look, Everett said, and if they find the stake, then we have direct physical evidence of tampering, Briggs said. Not just Boyle's testimony, which Sterling's attorney will try to discredit. Physical evidence. He looked at Boyle. You'd still need to testify. Your account establishes the chain of custody. Who removed it? How? When? I'll testify, Boyle said. He sounded like a man who had already argued this out with himself at length and arrived here because the argument was settled. That's why I'm here. Sterling will fire you, Lenora said. I'm already gone, Boyle said. I packed my things this morning before I rode over here. He just doesn't know it yet. Briggs sent the federal notification that afternoon through the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne, with Teal's formal identification of the stake as federal survey property and Boyle's account of its removal attached as a supporting statement. It was, as Briggs explained to Lenora afterward, not a guarantee. The Marshal's office might move slowly. They might find nothing. The stake might have been destroyed rather than disposed of. But it was real, and it was in motion, and for the first time since Sterling had ridden onto Copper Willow Land with his ultimatum, Everett felt the shape of the situation shift slightly in their direction. The problem was that shift did not go unnoticed. By Tuesday evening, word had apparently reached Black Mesa that something had changed. Everett became aware of this, not through any formal notification, but through the appearance of two of Sterling's regular men at the edge of Copper Willow's southern pasture. Not on the property, but visible from it, which was a message as clear as if it had been written down and delivered. He told Dell. Dell said, "He knows Boyle came over." "Yes, or he knows we filed with the marshal and he's figured out that someone gave us information specific enough to justify it. Same result either way," Dell said. "He's watching the property." "Not to cause trouble," Everett said, thinking through it. "To monitor. He wants to know if the marshal's men show up. He wants to know what's moving in and out of this property before the hearing. So, what do we do?" "Nothing different." Everett looked toward the southern pasture where the two riders were visible against the tree line. "We have what we have. The hearing is in 6 days. We let Briggs do his work and we keep the ranch running." Dell looked at him with the expression he reserved for situations where he thought Everett was being disciplined in a way that was admirable and also slightly maddening. "You're good at this," he said. "At what?" "Not showing your hand when you're anxious." "Who said I'm anxious?" "Shaw. You've checked your notebook 4 times today and you haven't written anything in it." Everett looked at him. "Go talk to Lenora," Dell said. "She's been on that porch for 2 hours." "She doesn't need me to." "I didn't say she needs you. I said go talk to her." Dell picked up his work gloves. "I'll keep an eye on the south pasture." Lenora was sitting in the chair at the left end of the porch. Her father's chair was the right one, the one with the worn armrests, and she consistently left it empty in the way people avoid a space that belongs to someone who isn't present. She had a ledger open on her knee but wasn't writing in it. She was looking at the middle distance with the focused emptiness that meant she was doing calculations in her head rather than on paper. Everett came up the porch steps and leaned against the rail, which was the appropriate level of proximity for a conversation that was not entirely work. "How's your father?" he said. "Resting. He rests more than he used to." She said it without self-pity, but carefully, the way you carry a cup that's filled too full. "Dr. Marsh was out yesterday. He says it's his heart. Not acutely dangerous at the moment, but not strong." She closed the ledger. "He can't have the kind of stress he's had this week, and there's another 6 days of it coming. It'll end after the hearing. If it goes our way." She looked at him. "Briggs thinks we have a strong case. You think we have a strong case. But Sterling's attorney is going to stand up in front of a territorial judge and tell a story where my father is a confused old man who mismanaged his property records, where you are a cowhand with no legal standing who manufactured evidence because you want access to an inheritance, and where Boyle is a disgruntled former employee with a grudge." She said it flatly. "Those stories aren't true, but they're simple, and simple stories are easier to follow than complicated ones." Everett was quiet for a moment. "Teal's field notes aren't simple to argue against," he said. "They're federal documentation from the original survey. Sterling's attorney can question Teal's memory, but he can't question the notes without arguing against the federal record." "I know." And Dell's testimony is specific. The exact language Harlan read at the signing. That's not something a man invents 18 years later. "I know that too." She pushed hair back from her face with a motion that was less about the hair and more about something she was trying to do with her hands. "I'm not arguing against our case, Everett. I'm telling you I'm scared." It was the first time she had used his given name without being invited to. He stayed where he was, didn't move toward it or away from it. "That's a reasonable thing to feel," he said. "I know it's reasonable. It doesn't help with the feeling." She looked out at the yard. "My father built this ranch. He built it when there was nothing here. Not the house, not the fences, not the water system. He built it while raising me after my mother died, which is not a small thing to do while also building a ranch." Her voice was steady. "If Sterling takes the water and the courts take the money and Copper Willow goes under, that's not just a financial loss. That's my father's life being picked apart by a man who has never worked for anything except the continuation of what someone else left him." "It won't go under," Everett said. She looked at him sharply, not angry, more like the look of a person who has had enough reassurances that weren't honest and is done accepting them. "How do you know?" "I don't know for certain," he said. "I know we have better evidence than he does. I know his case is built on manufactured documents and a removed stake that might now be found and produced in court. I know Briggs is competent and Teal is meticulous and Dell has a specific memory that is going to be very difficult to discredit." He paused. "And I know that I will do everything I am capable of doing before this hearing to make sure we walk in there with everything we need." Lenora looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she said. He recognized the question. It was the one she had asked him months ago in different words, the one he had avoided answering completely every time. "I already told you," he said. "You told me it was because it was wrong and you could do something about it." She kept her eyes on him. "I'm asking the part you didn't tell me." The evening was settling around them, the light going from gold to the flatter blue that came just before dark. Somewhere behind the barn, two of the hands were talking, voices carrying without the words being distinguishable, which was the ordinary sound of a ranch in the evening. "You know the part I didn't tell you," he said. "I want to hear you say it." He looked out at the yard for a moment, then back at her. "I care what happens to this ranch because I care what happens to you," he said. "That's the whole of it." She didn't say anything immediately. "And what are you going to do about that?" she said finally. "Nothing," he said, "because I have nothing to offer you, and I am not going to spend time I could use helping you keep this ranch standing on trying to argue myself into thinking otherwise." The words were honest and they cost him something, which was probably why he said them as plainly as he did. There was a kind of relief in saying a thing you'd held back long enough that it had started to press against the inside of you. Lenora looked at him for another moment. Her expression was not what he expected, which was the neutral acknowledgement of a woman who had heard a declaration and found it insufficient. It was something more complicated than that. "You are the most frustrating man I have ever met," she said. "I've been told I'm tolerable to work with," he said. The corner of her mouth moved in the way that was not quite a smile but was close enough to register. "Go get some sleep," she said. "You look terrible. I've looked worse. I know. Go anyway." He went. The marshal's men arrived on Wednesday morning, two federal deputies who had ridden overnight from the territory office. They were brisk and formal and did not offer any indication of what they expected to find, which Briggs said was standard procedure and meant nothing either way. They rode out with directions toward the old mine shaft on Black Mesa's eastern range, accompanied by the territorial sheriff from Briar Hollow and a surveyor the marshal's office had brought as a technical witness. Everett did not go with them. He spent the morning working, repairing a section of fence on the north pasture that had been on his mental list for 2 weeks and that he'd kept not getting to. The physical work helped. It gave him somewhere to put his hands while the rest of his mind turned over the hearing structure again and again, looking for the places where Sterling's attorney could find a gap and working out how to close them. Dell found him at noon. "They're back," Dell said. Everett set down the fence wire. "And?" Dell's expression told him before the words did. "They found it," Dell said. "Bottom of the shaft under about 4 feet of debris. It's the stake. Original markings still legible." He paused. "Garver's been taken into custody." Everett stood very still for a moment. "Sterling himself?" "Not yet," Dell said. "Garver is saying Sterling ordered it, but that's his word so far. The deputies took a full statement. If Garver's saying Sterling ordered it, he's either telling the truth because he's scared or he's protecting himself by shifting blame up the chain." Everett thought. Either way, it puts Sterling in the conversation. Briggs is talking to the deputies now. They walked back toward the main house, and Everett noticed that several of the ranch hands had stopped their work and were standing in loose clusters watching the direction of the yard. Word moved fast on a ranch. It always had. Lenora was on the porch when they arrived. She had her arms crossed, not in the controlled fury posture from before, but in the posture of someone who has just heard something unexpected and is absorbing it. "They found the stake," she said, when Everett reached the steps. "Yes." "And Garver's in custody." "Yes." She looked at him. "You told the marshal's office exactly where to look." "I gave them the general location based on what Boyle knew and what I knew about the terrain," he said. "The rest was their work." Everett. She said his name with the same directness she applied to everything. You've been running this defense for 2 weeks. You rode 120 miles on your own time and your own provisions. You found the surveyor, you documented the evidence, you coordinated Boyle's testimony, and you pointed the federal deputies at a mine shaft on Black Mesa Range. She stopped. You are the lowest paid man on this property. That's true, he said. I'm raising your wages, she said. That's not... Don't argue with me about your wages, Shaw. I know what this ranch can afford, and I know what fair looks like. She held his look for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for the subject of wages. Let's go hear what Briggs has to say. What Briggs had to say was delivered in Harlan's study with the recovered stake standing against the wall in the corner. The federal deputies had allowed Briggs to retain it as an exhibit pending the hearing, provided it was kept under documented custody. It was a strange thing to have in a room. It was just a weathered timber post, perhaps 50 inches long, gray with age and split along one face. But the survey markings were there, and the 1871 date was there, and its presence made the room feel different in a way that was hard to explain and didn't need to be. Harlan was present for this meeting. He was in his chair with a blanket across his knees, which was new, and he sat straighter than he had in days, which Everett suspected was partly stubbornness and partly the fact that the news had done something to him. The stake is recovered, Briggs said. Garver's statement named Sterling Rourke as having ordered its removal, citing the pending water claim as the reason. The territorial marshal has forwarded the case to federal authority given the nature of the marker. He paused. Sterling Rourke may face federal charges related to the destruction of federal survey property, separate from and in addition to the water rights case. Harlan said, Is Rourke going to try to settle before the hearing? He may, Briggs said. If I were his attorney, I would advise him to. His water claim is now extremely difficult to prosecute successfully with the stake recovered, Teal's testimony established, and Garver's statement on record. He looked at the assembled faces in the room. However, Sterling Rourke has never had a claim to reach a public hearing. I don't know whether his response to pressure is to settle or to fight. Some men fight harder when they're cornered. He'll fight, Lenora said. He's been building this for 2 years. He's not going to walk away from it because the evidence got harder. If he fights, Everett said, then we go to the hearing with everything we have, which is more than enough. Marcus Feld, who had stayed at Copper Willow through the week as a witness to Sterling's pattern of behavior in other disputes, spoke up from his seat near the window. There's something else to consider, he said. The ranchers around Briar Hollow who have been sitting neutral on this, watching to see how it resolved before they formed opinions. Garver's arrest is going to move them. He looked at Harlan. You've had men pressure neutral on your claim all week. After today, I think that changes. Community standing at a hearing matters, Briggs confirmed. A judge weighing a contested case pays attention to the room. Harlan looked at Everett. He had been doing this periodically throughout the meeting, looking at Everett in the way of a man who has something he wants to say and is choosing his moment for it. Shaw, he said. Sir, come see me after supper. Just you. The accusation arrived on Thursday. Everett should have anticipated it. Later, he would understand that he had anticipated it in a general way. He had known Sterling would not simply accept the deterioration of his case without response, but he had not anticipated the specific form it would take, and the specific form was worse than a general anticipation had prepared him for. It came first through the Briar Hollow postmaster, who mentioned it to the grain merchant, who mentioned it to a rancher named Pelham, who ran a small spread east of town. By Thursday afternoon, it had completed its circuit of the local community and found its way to Copper Willow through the mouth of one of the seasonal hands who had been in town for supplies. The story being told was this. Everett Shaw was a cowhand who had been in love with Lenora Whitlock for 3 years without prospects. He had seen in Sterling's water claim an opportunity to make himself indispensable and manufacture a reputation as Copper Willow's defender. He had ridden into the canyon country and falsified measurements. He had coached Amos Teal, an elderly man, on what to say. He had recruited a disgruntled employee of Black Mesa, and he had planted the survey stake in the mine shaft himself, or had someone plant it, in order to frame Sterling Rourke and ensure that the hearing produced the outcome that would make Lenora Whitlock grateful enough to consider marrying a man she would otherwise have had no reason to notice. It was, Everett recognized with cold clarity when it was described to him, well constructed. Every truth in it was bent just slightly off axis. He did care about Lenora. He had ridden into the canyon. He had recruited Boyle. The facts were real. Only what the facts meant had been changed, and the part about the stake, and the idea that he had planted it, was the most dangerous element because it reframed the physical evidence as the product of manipulation rather than discovery. Dell heard it in the bunkhouse first. He found Everett at the water trough. The same trough Everett noted distantly that he had patched on the morning Sterling first arrived and told him what was being said. Everett said nothing for a moment. 3 of the men believe it, Dell said. He didn't soften this. Harkins and the 2 Colorado boys. Harkins has been uneasy about this whole situation, and he's the type to look for an explanation that makes the world simpler. I know, Everett said. It's going to be repeated in town before the hearing. Sterling's attorney will find a way to introduce it at the proceeding, even if he can't use it as formal testimony. I know that too. So, Dell waited. What do you want to do? Everett looked at the trough. The patch he had hammered in at dawn weeks ago now was still holding. He had used tin that was slightly too thick for the application, but it had worked, and the join was solid where it needed to be. Nothing different, he said. Dell stared at him. Shaw, the stake was found by federal deputies who had no connection to Copper Willow, Everett said. It was documented by officers of the federal marshal's office, not by me. Garver's statement was given to the deputies, not to Briggs. The survey notes belong to Teal, who has had them for 18 years. I can't fabricate federal officers. He looked at Dell directly. If we start responding to every story Sterling puts into circulation, we spend the next 6 days defending accusations instead of building the case. Briggs presents the evidence. The evidence answers the accusation. And if the judge listens to the story instead of the evidence, then it's a bad judge and we're in trouble regardless of what we do. Everett straightened. But a judge who looks at Teal's 18-year-old field notes and federal deputies' documentation and thinks I manufactured all of that, that's a judge who made up his mind before the hearing. Dell was quiet. Go back to work, Everett said. He said it without anger, which was harder than it sounded because underneath the measured thinking and the controlled response, there was a particular rage at the elegance of what Sterling had done. Not at the accusation of manipulation, that was expected, that was the weapon. But at the way it used the most real thing Everett had, the feeling he'd carried quietly for 3 years, careful and contained and never offered to anyone, used as a tool to suggest that nothing he had done was honest. He stood at the trough for another moment. Then he picked up the bucket he'd set down and went back to work. Harlan was waiting for him after supper, as he'd said. The study was lit by a single lamp, which made the room smaller and warmer than it was in daytime, and Harlan was in his chair with his hands on the armrests in the way of a man who had decided to sit properly rather than slump, which cost him something. Sit down, Harlan said. Everett sat. I heard what's being said in town, Harlan said. Yes, sir. I also know it isn't true. He said it with no particular emphasis, not as a compliment or a declaration, but simply as a statement of fact, the way he'd say the south fence needs mending. Accurate. Settled. Everett said nothing. What I want to know, Harlan said, is whether you can go into that hearing room in 5 days and stand in front of a territorial judge while Sterling's attorney says what he's going to say. And not break. I won't break, Everett said. I don't mean physically. Harlan's eyes were steady on him. I mean stay straight, stay useful. Not say something in the room that turns the temperature against us because a lawyer found the sore spot and pressed it. He'll try to use how I feel about Lenora, Everett said, straight out. That's the pressure point, that everything I did was for personal interest. Yes, Harlan said, and what I'll say is that I did what was right because it was right, and that whatever else I carry has no bearing on the accuracy of the evidence. He met Harlan's eyes. Which is the truth? Harlan studied him for a long moment. You'd walk away from her if you thought it was the right thing for her, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Everett said. That's what I thought, Harlan said. He looked at the lamp for a moment. I want you to understand something before we go into that hearing. Whatever happens in that room, however the judge rules, you have already done something for this ranch and for my daughter that cannot be undone by a court's decision. He paused. I want you to know I see that. Everett held the old man's look. Thank you, sir, he said. Quietly. Harlan nodded once. Get some sleep. Briggs wants everyone sharp by 6 tomorrow morning. Everett stood and moved toward the door. Shaw, he stopped. She's not unaware of what you've done, Harlan said, in case you'd convinced yourself otherwise. Everett said nothing to that. He went out and pulled the door shut behind him and stood in the hallway for a moment in the dark. 5 days. Whatever he was or was not, Whatever he had or did not have, the only thing that mattered now was what happened in that hearing room. The hearing was held in the Briar Hollow Territorial Courthouse on a Tuesday morning in late October, in a room that was not large enough for the number of people who came to fill it. Everett noticed the crowd before he noticed anything else. He had expected the formal parties: Briggs and Sterling's attorney, the judge, the witnesses on both sides, some territorial officials. What he had not expected was the degree to which word had traveled. Ranchers he recognized from the surrounding spreads had ridden in. Townspeople filled the gallery benches. There were faces he knew and faces he didn't, and the collective presence of them created a quality of attention in the room that was different from mere curiosity. These were people who understood that what happened here would affect the water supply for the entire region during drought years, and they had come to watch it be decided. Sterling Rourke was already seated when Everett arrived with the Copper Willow party. He was at the plaintiff's table in a dark coat that had clearly been purchased for occasions of this kind, with his attorney, a man named Caldwell who had been brought in from Cheyenne and who had the careful grooming and the pleasant, slightly vague expression of someone whose pleasantness was entirely professional, seated beside him. Sterling looked at Everett once when Everett entered the room. It was a brief look, calibrated to communicate nothing in particular, which communicated more than something particular would have. Harlan was seated beside Lenora in the front row of the gallery. I had insisted on attending despite everything, and the compromise was that 2 chairs had been arranged at the end of the row so he could rise easily if needed, and so Lenora could be close without being visibly supporting him. He was dressed in his best clothes, which were old but well kept, and he sat with the deliberate straightness of a man who will not let a room see him diminished. Lenora had said almost nothing on the ride into town. She sat beside her father and looked at the room with the focused stillness she brought to situations she could not control and had decided to endure properly. Briggs was at the defense table organizing his documents in the specific order he had explained to Everett twice, a sequence that built from the foundational evidence toward the testimony, which was the reverse of how Sterling's attorney would likely proceed. Teal sat in the witness waiting area with his field notes on his knee, looking like a man doing mental arithmetic. Dell was already seated in the gallery with Marcus Feld and Curtis Boyle. Boyle had arrived in his own clothes, not his Black Mesa work gear, which he'd apparently left behind when he packed. And he sat with the particular stillness of someone who has made a choice they're still living with, which was accurate. The judge was a territorial appointee named Haverford, 50 years old, wire-rimmed spectacles, the manner of a man who had heard many arguments and had formed the opinion that most of them were longer than necessary. He came in without ceremony, arranged his own papers, and looked at both tables. This is a territorial water rights hearing in the matter of Black Mesa Ranch versus Copper Willow Ranch concerning the claim boundary of Silverhead Spring, he said. We'll proceed in the standard order. Plaintiff presents first. I will ask questions as I have them. Witnesses will be called in the sequence agreed upon by both counsels. He looked over his spectacles at Caldwell and then at Briggs. I have read the pre-filed documentation from both parties. I have also been notified by the Federal Marshal's Office of the related criminal matter. I want to be clear that this hearing addresses water rights only. The criminal proceeding is separate, and I will not allow it to be used to try the criminal case inside this room. Is that understood? Yes, Your Honor, Caldwell said. Yes, Your Honor, Briggs said. Haverford nodded once. Begin. Caldwell was good. Everett had expected competence, but watching the attorney work was a different thing from expecting it. He had a quality of patient reasonableness. He never raised his voice, never pressed dramatically, never implied that the other side was dishonest when he could instead imply they were simply confused. It was a more effective approach than aggression because it made disagreeing with him feel like an overreaction. He presented Sterling's water claim first in its documentary form. The territorial filing, the legal citation, the argument about the incomplete territorial records. He acknowledged, without being asked, that the federal field notes existed, and characterized them as historical documentation that did not necessarily reflect current boundary accuracy, given the passage of time and the acknowledged absence of one of the 3 original markers. This was the first place Everett noticed Caldwell's construction. He had incorporated the recovered stake into his argument preemptively, not as evidence of tampering, but as an acknowledgement that the boundary situation was complicated. He had not mentioned Garver. He had not mentioned the mine shaft. He spoke of the missing marker in the abstract as though it had simply gone missing in the way that old things go missing. Judge Haverford, to his credit, stopped him. Counselor, The pre-filed materials indicate that the second marker was recovered by federal deputies from a specific location on Black Mesa property. I'd like you to address that directly rather than in the general. A small pause. Your Honor, the recovery of that marker is the subject of a separate criminal proceeding, as you noted. We are contesting its relevance to the water rights question. Its relevance to the water rights question, Haverford said, is that it was a federal survey marker for the boundary under dispute, its location when recovered, and the circumstances of how it came to be in that location bear on whether the boundary documentation is complete. You may continue, but I'll want that addressed before we're done. Caldwell accepted this without showing anything. He continued. His two witnesses for the 1882 debt claim were a man named Prosser, who had apparently been employed by Black Mesa in some administrative capacity, and a retired merchant from Briar Hollow named Cagle. Prosser testified that he had been present when the 1882 agreement was signed and that Harlan Whitlock had understood it to be an ongoing arrangement. Cagle testified that Harlan had spoken to him in 1884 about the continued water arrangement with Black Mesa as though it were permanent. Briggs cross-examined Prosser first. You were employed by Black Mesa Ranch in 1882 in what capacity? Bookkeeping and administrative records. And you were present at the signing of the 1882 agreement between Harlan Whitlock and the then owner of Black Mesa Ranch? I was. Were you in the room when the document was read aloud before signing? A brief pause. I was near the room. Near the room, Briggs said, without inflection. Could you hear what was read? I heard some of it. What specifically did you hear regarding the duration of the arrangement? Prosser's answer was careful and took a long time and ultimately did not include the word temporary or any equivalent. Briggs let it stand without pressing. He moved to Cagle, whose testimony about what Harlan had said in 1884 was secondhand and admitted under questioning to having been a general comment about water access rather than a specific reference to the 1882 agreement. Then Briggs called Dell. Dell walked to the stand with the slight favoring of his bad knee that he didn't try to conceal, sat down, and looked at the room with the expression of a man who has decided to be straightforward and is prepared to stay that way regardless of what happens. Briggs asked him to describe the 1882 signing event in his own words. I was outside the study door, Dell said. Harlan always read agreements aloud, said it prevented misunderstanding. He read the whole document before both parties signed it. The relevant part, and I remember it clearly because I'd been wondering all week whether Black Mesa was going to get permanent access to that spring, was that Black Mesa was granted emergency access to Silverhead Spring for one season only, to end the 1st of September, 1882, and that this access created no ongoing right to water use and could not be cited as precedent for future claims. He said it straight the same way he'd said it to Everett in the bunkhouse. Those were the words. Harlan read them twice. Caldwell cross-examined. Mr. Pruitt, you were outside the door. Yes. You did not see the document. No. I heard it read. You are now testifying 18 years after the fact about the specific wording of a document you did not read and were not officially present to witness. I'm testifying about what I heard, Dell said. My hearing was fine in 1882 and it's fine now. A brief ripple in the gallery. Haverford did not react. You have worked at Copper Willow Ranch for how many years? 22 years. You consider yourself loyal to Harlan Whitlock. I consider myself honest, Dell said. Those aren't always the same thing, but in this case they happen to be. Caldwell looked at him for a moment, then said, no further questions. Teal was next. The old surveyor took the stand with the deliberate movement of a man managing physical discomfort without complaint, set his field notes on the ledge beside him, and looked at Haverford directly. Briggs walked him through his credentials. The years of federal survey work, the nature of the General Land Office Commission, the standard practices for documentation and record keeping. Haverford listened with his pen moving. Mr. Teal, you personally supervised the 1871 boundary survey of Silverhead Spring. I led the crew, Teal said. 4 men. We placed 3 corner stakes on the North Canyon rim, establishing the eastern boundary of the Whitlock water claim. I have my field notes here with the precise locations, measurements, and a physical sketch of each stake placement showing the surrounding terrain features. He opened the notes. The measurements correspond to the survey stake recovered by federal deputies last week, which I was asked to examine yesterday evening. The marking system, the material, and the dimensions are consistent with the stakes placed by my crew in 1871. You examined the recovered stake? I did. And you are confident it is one of the original survey markers placed by your crew? I am. The carving method is mine. I trained my crew to do it the same way I was trained. Specific depth, specific sequence of notations. The stake recovered from the mine shaft matches my notes exactly. Caldwell's cross-examination was longer and more careful than the ones that had preceded it. He questioned Teal's certainty of memory. He questioned whether the field notes had been altered since 1871. He questioned whether the stake's markings were distinctive enough to be definitively attributable to a specific crew. I was polite throughout, in the manner of someone systematically loosening bolts without making noise about it. Teal answered each question with the patience of a man who had spent 50 years being precise and was not going to stop because someone was trying to make precision look like stubbornness. Mr. Teal, you have testified that your field notes have been in your personal possession since 1871. Correct. You have not filed them with any official body. I retain personal copies. The originals are with the General Land Office. The deputy who accompanied the survey party to examine the stake yesterday had a telegraphed confirmation from the land office that their records match my notes. That confirmation is in the pre-filed materials. Caldwell paused. It was a small pause, brief enough that most of the room probably didn't notice it. Everett noticed it. Caldwell had not known about the telegraph confirmation, or he had known and had hoped Teal would not raise it. Either way, it was a gap in his preparation, and gaps in preparation in a room like this had weight. He recovered cleanly. No further questions. Haverford looked at the field notes. Mr. Teal, the sketch you mentioned, showing the terrain features around each stake placement, is that in what you've provided? Yes, Your Honor, page 7. Haverford turned to page 7. He looked at it for a moment. The double-arched sandstone formation marked here as a reference point from the second stake position. This is a specific and distinctive formation? Very distinctive, Your Honor. I noted it specifically because it was the most reliable natural landmark in that section of the canyon, and this formation is still present in the terrain? Briggs stood. Your Honor, the pre-filed materials include measurements taken by Everett Shaw, the Copper Willow Ranch hand who first documented the survey sites, which include distance and bearing calculations from the double arch formation to the empty cairn position. The cairn's location, as documented by Mr. Shaw, matches the position indicated in Mr. Teal's 1871 sketch. Haverford looked at the sketch, then at Briggs's exhibit. He held both for a moment. Caldwell said, Your Honor, the ranch hand's measurements were made without official credentials or oversight. The federal deputies confirmed the cairn location independently, Briggs said. That confirmation is also in the materials. Haverford set both documents down and wrote something. Curtis Boyle was the last witness before the break. He walked to the stand, and the room went quieter in the particular way a room goes quiet when it understands that the next thing is going to matter. Briggs asked him to state his former employment, which Boyle did. He asked him to describe the events of the canyon ride, the gathering of men, the ride to the survey site, what he observed, what he did, and what the foreman told him afterward. Boyle described it the same way he'd described it at Copper Willow, cleanly, without decoration. He did not try to minimize his own participation, and he did not try to maximize Sterling's culpability. He said what he had seen and heard and done, and left the interpretation to the room. After the stake was removed, Briggs said, Did the foreman, Mr. Garver, say anything about who had ordered the removal? He said Mr. Rourke had instructed him to clear the canyon survey sites before the Whitlock people got out there. Those were his words. Clear the canyon survey sites. And you understood that to mean what? I understood it to mean remove whatever was out there that could help the Whitlock claim. The room was very still. Caldwell stood for cross-examination. He was precise and careful, and he went after Boyle's motivation, the timing of his departure from Black Mesa, whether he had been paid or promised anything by Copper Willow, whether his testimony was the product of resentment toward his former employer. Boyle answered everything without getting angry, which was harder than it looked, and Everett knew it. You left Black Mesa's employment the morning before you came to Copper Willow, Caldwell said. Yes. You packed your belongings and left without notice. Yes. Why? Because Garver told me the plan was to put the stake removal on me if the legal situation went wrong, Boyle said. That seemed like a good reason to leave. That's your claim. That's what happened. You have no documentation of that conversation. No. It was a conversation between two men in a bunkhouse. I didn't have a notary present. Boyle held Caldwell's look. But Garver's in federal custody, and I'd expect he's having a longer version of the same conversation with people who do write things down. Another ripple in the gallery. Haverford allowed it to settle on its own. No further questions, Caldwell said. The break was 20 minutes. Everett stepped outside into the cold air and stood on the courthouse steps. Dell came out behind him and stood beside him without speaking. Marcus Feld came out, looked at them both, and apparently decided not to say anything either, which was its own kind of assessment. After a moment, Lenora appeared. She had walked Harlan to a chair in the corridor where he could rest, and she came out alone. She stood next to Everett and looked at the street. "Caldwell is going to try something different in the second half," she said. "Yes. He's been too careful. That means he's got something he hasn't used yet." Everett had been thinking the same thing. Caldwell had presented competently, but he had not pressed hard on anything, which meant either he was conserving something or he was planning to let the evidence build before he applied what he actually had. "If he introduces the story about you," Lenora said, "about your reasons for doing this, what are you going to do?" "Nothing." She turned to look at him. "I can't stop him from saying it," Everett said, "and responding to it makes it bigger. Briggs knows how to handle it and redirect." "That's the strategic answer," Lenora said. "I'm asking what you're going to do when you're sitting in that room listening to a man tell a story about you in front of your employer and your neighbors and a territorial judge." He looked at her. "I'm going to sit still," he said, "same as I always do when something matters." She held his look for a moment. "You should know," she said quietly, "that whatever he says in there, and whatever the judge decides, what you've done in the last 2 weeks changes nothing and also changes everything. I want you to know that before you go back in." He didn't answer. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because the answer was the kind of thing that needed more space than courthouse steps and 20 minutes afforded it. "Come on," he said. "We should go back in." Caldwell's remaining argument centered on two things: the incompleteness of the boundary documentation as a legal matter regardless of the recovered stake, and there it was, the credibility of the defense's primary investigator. He did not call Everett as a witness. He introduced the story through implication, which was technically cleaner and harder to directly address. "Your Honor, the defense has built its case substantially on an investigation conducted by a ranch hand named Everett Shaw, a man who, by his own admission, has worked at Copper Willow Ranch for 3 years, who has no legal credentials or survey expertise, who conducted the initial canyon documentation without official oversight, and who directed the chain of events leading to the federal inquiry." He paused. "We are not disputing that Mr. Shaw is capable or well-intentioned. We are noting that the defense case rests heavily on the work of a man who has like a personal interest in the outcome of this proceeding that goes beyond his employment." He did not say what the personal interest was. He didn't need to. The sentence did its work without specifics, and Everett, seated beside Briggs, felt the weight of the room shift slightly. The particular quality of attention that a room gives to a story it has already heard and is now hearing again from a different angle. Haverford looked up. "Counselor, are you alleging misconduct?" "I'm noting a credibility consideration, Your Honor. The defense is asking this court to rely on documentation produced by a party with undisclosed personal motivations." Briggs stood. "Your Honor, Mr. Shaw's documentation was confirmed independently by federal deputies and by Amos Teal's 18-year-old field notes. If a opposing counsel wants to argue that Everett Shaw influenced the federal deputies, the 1871 survey records, and the physical characteristics of a stake carved before Shaw was born, I'd like to hear that argument explicitly." A sound in the gallery. Not loud. Brief. Haverford looked at Caldwell. "Do you have evidence of falsification?" A measured pause. "We are noting that the circumstances of the evidence discovery..." Counselor. "Do you have evidence that the documentation was falsified?" "Not at this time, Your Honor." "Then I'll address the documentation on its merits." Haverford made a note. Continue. The closing arguments took 40 minutes. Caldwell's was competent, and it emphasized the territorial legal framework. The argument that even with the survey notes, the territorial filing process required specific, current documentation that Copper Willow had not maintained. It was a technical argument, and it was not bad. Briggs's was shorter and built on a single line from the pre-filed telegraph confirmation from the General Land Office that the Silverhead Spring boundary, as established in 1871, had never been legally challenged, modified, or transferred. "The boundary is not in question because Copper Willow's records are imperfect," Briggs said. "The boundary is in question because a neighboring party filed a claim against it and then attempted to destroy the physical evidence that disproved the claim. The question before this court is not whether the boundary documentation is complete. It is whether a valid, federally established boundary can be invalidated by the deliberate removal of evidence." He paused. The answer to that question, under both territorial and federal law, is no. Haverford recessed for deliberation. The wait was 45 minutes. Everett spent most of it outside on the steps again. Lenora sat with her father inside. Dell found a chair near the door and waited with the patience of a man who had learned the hard way that impatience didn't accelerate anything. When Haverford returned, the gallery filled back up quickly, with the quality of contained urgency that large rooms get when something is about to be settled. The judge arranged his papers. He looked at both tables. In the matter of Black Mesa Ranch's water claim against Copper Willow Ranch concerning Silverhead Spring, he said, I find as follows. The 1871 Federal Survey establishing the eastern boundary of the Whitlock water claim is valid and was properly filed with the General Land Office. The documentation produced at this hearing, including the field notes of surveyor Amos Teal and the independently confirmed location of the survey markers, establishes that the spring falls within Copper Willow's established boundary. He paused. The claim that the 1882 drought year agreement constitutes an ongoing water right is not supported by the testimony presented. The witness testimony indicates the arrangement was explicitly temporary, and no documentation has been produced contradicting that characterization. Another pause. The water claim filed by Black Mesa Ranch is denied. Sterling Rourke sat without moving. Caldwell said something quietly to him. Sterling did not respond visibly. Furthermore, Haverford continued, I am referring the matter of the survey marker removal to the federal authority already in possession of the criminal case. My findings regarding the marker's validity and original placement will be included in that referral. He looked over his spectacles at Sterling's table. The integrity of the federal survey record is not a private matter. He closed his file. This hearing is concluded. The sound in the room after Haverford left was not dramatic. It wasn't cheering. This was a territorial courthouse, not a theater. It was more the particular sound of a large number of people releasing breath they had been holding and beginning to talk at ordinary volume again after a long period of keeping it down. Chairs moved, people stood. The collective energy of the room shifted from concentrated attention to ordinary movement. Lenora put her hand over her father's hand. Harlan sat with his eyes closed for a moment. Then he opened them and looked at Lenora with an expression that had about 18 years of held tension in it. Well, he said. Yes, she said. He patted her hand once, the way men of his generation and his particular kind of self-containment expressed what they were not going to say aloud, and that was enough. Everett stayed at the table until the room had mostly emptied, going over nothing, just sitting with the settled quality of a thing that was done. Briggs was organizing documents beside him. Teal appeared at Everett's shoulder and said, solid outcome, which from Teal was something close to effusive. Dell found him when the room had thinned. You all right? Dell asked. Yes. You don't look all right. I'm tired, Everett said. I'm fine. Dell looked at him with the expression of a man who knew the difference between the two, but was going to let it stand. Sterling left through the side door, he said. Didn't speak to anyone. He'll be back, Everett said. Not on this. This is done. But men like Sterling find another angle. Maybe, Dell said. Or maybe losing publicly in front of half the county is the kind of thing that takes the appetite out of a man. Everett thought about this. I was not optimistic about Sterling Rourke's capacity for learning lessons from public humiliation, but it was possible that the additional federal criminal exposure would concentrate his priorities in a different direction. It was also possible that none of it mattered right now, in this immediate hour, and that what mattered was what was right in front of him. He stood up. Lenora was across the emptying room, helping Harlan to his feet with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to help without making the help visible. Harlan was standing, which was good. He looked depleted but not broken, which was something. Everett crossed the room. He stopped in front of them. Harlan looked at him for a long moment, the same measuring look he'd given Everett in the study weeks ago, and at the corral before that, and on the porch the morning Sterling had first come with his ultimatum. Only this time the calculation at the end of the look was different. It had arrived somewhere. Come to the house tonight, Harlan said. After supper. There's something I want to say to you. Sir, Everett said, and he thought he knew what the conversation was going to be, and he thought he knew what he was going to have to say in return, and the knowledge of it sat in his chest in the specific way that hard, true things sit, not painfully, but with weight. Lenora was watching him. He met her eyes briefly, then looked away. I'll be there, he said. Outside, the October air had gone cold in the way Wyoming cold came, without warning, without gradation, just there, the way a door opened into it. The street was ordinary. Horses at the posts, a few wagons moving, the Briar Hollow residents returning to their afternoon as though the thing that had just happened inside that building was already becoming the past, which it was. Everett stood on the steps for a moment. Then he went to get Cutter from the livery and began the ride back to Copper Willow, where there was still work that needed doing and a conversation coming that he intended to face the same way he'd faced everything else in the last 2 weeks. Straight, and without flinching, and as honestly as he knew how. The ride back to Copper Willow took an hour, and Everett spent most of it not thinking about the hearing. The hearing was done. The ruling was what it was, which was what they had worked for, and turning it over in his mind would not change it or improve upon it. What occupied him instead was the conversation Harlan had requested, and the thing he would have to say in it, and whether he had the discipline to say it cleanly without making it about something it wasn't. He had thought, in the weeks leading up to the hearing, that winning the water claim would resolve the complicated shape of his situation at Copper Willow. He understood now, on the road back, that it had resolved nothing about that particular matter and had in fact made it more urgent. You could not spend 2 weeks doing what he had done, the writing, the testimony, the evidence, the hearing room, and pretend the doing of it was purely professional. The reasons behind it had been stated in enough rooms by enough people, including Caldwell in front of a territorial judge, that pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. And Everett was done with dishonesty in any form, including the comfortable kind you practiced on yourself. Cutter moved steadily underneath him. The road was familiar. The light had gone flat and cool, the kind of October afternoon that reminded you winter was not a threat, but a schedule. He thought about what he would say to Harlan. He thought about what was true and whether he could say it without it becoming something Harlan had to manage on top of everything else the old man was already carrying. And he thought, not for the first time, about what it meant to care about someone enough to put what was right for them ahead of what you wanted. And how that calculation, when you were honest about it, was not always as clear as it sounded when other people said it. By the time Copper Willow's roofline came into view, he had decided. He would say what was true, he would say it plainly and without asking for anything, and he would let Harlan do what he wanted with it. He unsaddled Cutter, rubbed him down, made sure he had feed and water. He checked the water trough, still holding, the patch still solid. He walked the perimeter of the near pasture out of habit, checking the fence line in the last of the afternoon light. He did these things because they were his work and because doing your work on the same day that something large happens is a way of reminding yourself that the world is larger than any single event in it. Dell arrived back from town as the last light was going. He looked at Everett across the yard. "You eaten?" Dell said. "Not yet. Come eat something before whatever Harlan has planned for you. You've had nothing since this morning, and you look like it." They ate in the bunkhouse with 2 of the other hands, Harkins included, who said nothing about the hearing and ate his food with the slightly careful manner of a man who has recently discovered his assessment of a situation was wrong and is deciding how to handle that quietly. Everett didn't force it. He ate and said little and let the ordinary noise of the bunkhouse at supper do what it was supposed to do. After Dell said, "You know what Harlan's gonna say?" "I think so." "And what are you going to tell him?" Everett set his cup down. "The truth." Dell nodded slowly. "Just the truth, or all of it?" "Both are the same thing in this case." Dell was quiet for a moment. Then, "She was watching you the whole time in that courtroom. You know that." "She was watching the proceedings," Everett said. Dell looked at him with an expression that had long since passed patience and was now residing somewhere in the territory of mild resignation. "Shaw, I have known you for 3 years. I have watched you talk yourself out of things that were clearly good for you because you decided you weren't entitled to them. I am asking you, as a man who has ridden 100 miles in bad weather for your sake in the last 2 weeks, to stop doing that for 5 minutes tonight." Everett picked his cup back up, looked at it, set it down again. "Go on," Dell said. "He's waiting." The main house was lit warmly against the dark. Everett knocked at the front door, which he did not usually do, and he generally came to the side entrance like the rest of the hands. But tonight felt like a front door occasion, for reasons he couldn't entirely articulate except that it was more honest about what kind of conversation this was. Lenora opened it. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. She had changed out of the clothes she'd worn to the hearing and was in the ordinary working clothes of an evening at the ranch, which somehow made her look more herself than the formal version had. "He's in the study," she said. She stepped back to let him in. "Are you joining us?" he asked. "Not unless he asks me to." She held his look for a second. "He knows what he wants to say to you. Let him say it." Everett nodded and went down the hall. Harlan was in his chair behind the desk, not with the deliberate straightness of the courthouse, but with the ordinary posture of a man in his own space at the end of a long day. The lamp was on. The pocket watch that usually lived in his vest pocket was on the desk in front of him, which Everett noticed because Harlan was not a man who put things on surfaces without reason. "Sit down," Harlan said. Everett sat. Harlan looked at him for a moment. There was quality to the old rancher's face tonight that Everett had not seen before. Something that had settled, like ground after a long rain. The hearing had not simply ended the water dispute. It had resolved something in Harlan that had been unresolved for longer than 2 weeks. "I'm going to say some things," Harlan said, "and I'd like you to let me finish before you say anything." "All right. You came to this ranch 3 years ago with a bedroll and a horse and a letter that said you were honest and capable." Harlan's hands were flat on the desk. "In 3 years, I have not seen you take a thing that wasn't yours. I've seen you give up your own pay for a man with a sick family. I've seen you work on the back fence at 4 in the morning because it needed doing and it wasn't anybody else's turn. I've seen you treat my daughter with more genuine respect than men who rode up here with full wallets and clean boots and called it courtship." He paused. "I've seen you ride 120 miles on your own time and your own provisions to protect something that doesn't legally belong to you." "It belonged to Lenora," Everett said, "and you said one thing at a time." Harlan almost smiled. "So I did." He looked at the pocket watch on the desk. "My health is not good, Shaw. Marsh was straight with me about what that means and how long I've likely got. I'm telling you this, not for sympathy, but because it's the context for what I'm going to say next." Everett said nothing. "Lenora can run this ranch," Harlan said. "She has been running most of it for 2 years without telling me so I wouldn't feel useless, which is exactly the kind of thing she does. She doesn't need a man to manage Copper Willow for her." He stopped. "But a ranch this size, in a territory that still has men like Sterling Work in it, needs someone beside her who will fight for what's right when the fighting has to happen. Not someone who fights because it's his property. Someone who fights because it's right." His eyes were steady. "You understand the difference." "Yes, sir," Everett said quietly. "I'm not asking you to take care of my daughter," Harlan said. "I'm asking you to stand beside her. Those are different things, and I need you to understand that I know they're different before I say the rest." Everett waited. "What do you intend to do about her?" Harlan said. The same question he had asked before, but this time the room around it was different, and both men in it were different, and the question meant something more specific than it had before. Everett looked at the desk, at the pocket watch sitting there in the lamplight, scratched and worn and clearly old. "I told you before that I have nothing to offer her," he said. "You did. I still don't have land or money or a name that means anything in this county." He said it not as an argument, but as an accounting. What happened in the last 2 weeks doesn't change that. I did what I did because it was right not to build a case for myself. "I know that," Harlan said. "That's the point." Everett looked up at him. "Land burns," Harlan said. "I've watched 3 good ranches go to fire in this territory. Cattle die. Disease, weather, bad luck, things no man can prevent. Banks fail. Names that meant something in this county 20 years ago don't mean a thing now." He leaned forward slightly. "But you freed a colt from a fence in a storm when no one was watching. You gave your wages to a man who couldn't feed his family, and you told nobody. You rode into Canyon Country alone and put your wages and your horse and your reputation on the stake of doing what was right." He paused. "Most importantly, when you believed loving Lenora might cost her something, you were willing to walk away. That is not a man with nothing to offer. That is a man offering exactly what cannot be bought." The room was very quiet. Everett held the old man's eyes and felt something in his chest that was complicated. Not release exactly, but the thing that comes just before release, when a weight you've carried long enough that you've stopped feeling it as separate from yourself begins to shift. "She deserves someone who can build something with her," he said. It came out less steadily than he intended. "Then build something," Harlan said. "I'm not giving you Copper Willow. This ranch is Lenora's inheritance and it stays hers. What I'm telling you is that building beside someone is not the same as having nothing." He sat back. "Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." "Good." Harlan looked at the pocket watch on the desk. He picked it up and held it in both hands for a moment with the care of a man handling something that has long since passed the point of being just an object. Then he set it in front of Everett. "Take that." Everett looked at it. "It was my father's," Harlan said. "He gave it to me when I came west. It's been in more difficult situations than I can count, and it still keeps reasonable time." He paused. "I'm not giving it to you as a gift. I'm giving it to you because I want you to have something of mine with you when you talk to her, so you understand that what I've said here is not just words." Everett picked up the watch. It was heavier than it looked, the case worn smooth on one side where a thumb had rubbed it for decades. He held it. "Go find her," Harlan said. "She's been on that porch for 40 minutes pretending to do nothing." She was on the porch, not in her father's chair and not in her usual one, but on the top step, sitting with her knees drawn up and her arms around them in the posture of a person who has given up on looking composed and is just sitting. The night was clear and cold, and the stars were the sharp Wyoming kind that seemed closer than stars had any right to be. Everett came through the front door and stopped on the porch. She looked up at him. He sat down on the step beside her. Not beside her exactly, a foot of space between them, but beside her in the sense that mattered. He had the pocket watch in his hand. He put it in his coat pocket. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The night was very quiet except for the ordinary sounds of a ranch at rest. Somewhere a horse, somewhere the low sound of the wind working at something it hadn't finished with yet. "He told you to come find me," she said. "Yes." "What did he say?" Everett thought about how to answer this. He said, "Land burns and cattle die and names stop meaning things," he said. "And then he said some things that were specifically about me, which I'm going to have some trouble repeating without sounding like I think more of myself than I do." The corner of her mouth moved. "He gave me his watch," Everett said. She turned to look at him fully. Something changed in her face. Not surprise exactly, because she knew her father and probably understood what the watch meant. Something more like the expression of someone watching a thing arrive that they had been waiting for long enough that they'd started to wonder if it was coming. "Everett," she said. "I know I have nothing that counts in the conventional accounting," he said. "I know what your ranch is worth, and I know what I'm worth in the literal, countable sense, and the distance between those two numbers is not small." He looked at his hands. "I also know that I have spent 3 years watching you and thinking things I didn't say because I decided the saying of them would cost you something I didn't have the right to cost you." "I know," she said quietly, "and I know that 2 weeks of doing what was right doesn't change the accounting." He paused. "But your father asked me what I intend to do, and I have been honest with him in everything else, so I told him the truth. I want to be beside you. I want to work beside you and build something beside you. Not own it, not run it, not replace what you've already built. Just be there, every day, doing the work." He stopped. "That's what I have. That's the whole of what I have." Lenora was looking at him with an expression he could not fully read, which was unusual. He had learned most of her expressions in 3 years and could generally place them. This one was new, or he had not seen it directed at him before. "Do you know what I told a man from Denver 2 years ago?" she said. "He came out here with a letter of introduction and good boots and a speech about partnership, and he spent 3 days telling me what Copper Willow could become under proper management." She kept her eyes on Everett. "I told him I wasn't looking for someone to manage what I had. I was looking for someone who understood why it mattered." Everett said nothing. "You understood why it mattered before you ever had a reason to care about it," she said. "You patched my water trough at 4 a.m. before anyone asked you to. You gave your wages to Roy Hicks when his boy was sick and told nobody." She stopped. I knew. I noticed things too." "Lenora, I'm not finished." She turned fully toward him. "You sat across from me on this porch and told me you had nothing to offer, and then you went and did everything that needed doing. You found the surveyor, and you documented the evidence, and you pointed the federal deputies at that mine shaft, and you sat in that courtroom while Caldwell tried to use what you feel about me to make everything you'd done look dishonest." Her voice was steady and very direct. "And then you sat still. You just sat still and let the evidence speak." "It was the right thing to do," he said. "I know it was. That's what I'm telling you." She reached over and took his hand. Not gently, not tentatively, but in the decisive way she did everything, her fingers wrapping around his with the particular certainty of someone who has made up their mind and is done being careful about it. "I already have the land and the cattle and the money. I have had them my whole life, and they are good things, and I am grateful for them. But they have never once kept me from being alone in a way that mattered." He looked down at her hand holding his. His hands were rough from work, from fences and rope and the constant ordinary labor of the life he'd built in the only way he knew how to build anything, which was steadily and without announcement. Her hands were rough too, which was something he had noticed years ago and had thought about more than was probably wise. "I'm not a wealthy man," he said. One more time, because it was true and it deserved to be said clearly before it was set aside. "Everett." She said his name the way she'd said it on the courthouse steps, direct without decoration. "I know exactly what you are. I've been watching you for 3 years. A pause. "Stop counting what you don't have." He was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with the dry sound of late autumn, and somewhere on the property, a door opened and closed. One of the hands, the ordinary nightlife of the ranch. "All right," he said. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was not the kind of thing that gets repeated afterward as a turning point in a story. It was just 2 words, said simply, in the cold October dark, on the porch of a ranch he had come to 3 years ago with nothing and was leaving. In some sense, in the only sense that mattered, with more than he had known how to want. She kept her hand in his. They sat there for a while without talking, which was comfortable in the way it had always been comfortable between them, going back to the first time they'd stood in the pre-dawn dark by the corral with coffee they hadn't acknowledged tasting. They married at Copper Willow in December before the first hard snow. It was not a large wedding. The hands attended. Teal came down from Garnet Junction, making the 62 miles in better spirits than the first time, and sat in the front row with his field notes conspicuously absent, which meant he had left them home, which was its own gesture. Marcus Feld came. Dell stood beside Everett in the practical role that fell to the man you had ridden into Canyon Country with and trusted with your silence. Harlan watched from his chair, which had been moved to the front of the gathering with no fuss and no comment, and the expression on his face was the one Everett would remember longest. Not joy exactly, though it was close, but the particular piece of a man who has done everything he could do and has found, at the end of the doing, that it was enough. Briggs sent a letter from Cheyenne that arrived 2 days after, which said that Sterling Rourke had entered a guilty plea on the federal charge related to the survey marker removal. Garver had cooperated fully with federal investigators, and the range of charges had been significant enough that Rourke's attorney had advised against fighting them in open court. Sterling paid a substantial fine, forfeited his water claim permanently, and retreated to the eastern portion of his holdings, where he became, over the following years, a considerably smaller figure in the territory than he had planned to be. Copper Willow ran a good winter. Everett spent the first months after the wedding doing what he had told Harlan he would do, which was building. Not the grand kind, not the kind that announced itself, but the steady, practical kind that accumulates into something real over time. He reorganized the water system on the north pasture to reduce the loss during freeze cycles. He worked out grazing agreements with 3 smaller ranches to the east that allowed all 4 operations to rotate stock during drought conditions, spreading the risk in a way that benefited everyone involved. He bred Cutter with 2 of Copper Willow's mares and got 1 foal that turned out to have exceptional ground manners and eventually exceptional everything else. He worked. That was the whole of it. He got up before most of the hands and he worked until the light was gone and sometimes past it. Not because he was trying to prove something, but because the work was there and he was capable of doing it and doing it well gave him the specific quiet satisfaction that he had always found in useful things done honestly. Lenora worked beside him, which was what she had always done on her own ranch, and continued doing on the ranch that was still hers, which Everett understood and which remained, on his best days and his most honest days. Something he was genuinely glad about. He was not a man who needed to own things to feel real. He was, as it turned out, a man who needed to be useful to people and places he cared about, which is a different thing and in some ways a better one. There were hard seasons. A cattle sickness in the 2nd year cost them 11 head and a month of sleep. A drought in the 3rd year tested the grazing agreements he'd made, and for 6 weeks it wasn't clear they would hold. They held. There was a winter where Harlan's condition worsened to the point where Dr. Marsh came 3 times in 1 month, and Lenora's stillness during those weeks was the kind of stillness that costs everything to maintain, and Everett stayed close and said little and did the extra work without noting that he was doing it. Harlan died in the spring of the 4th year. He died peacefully, which was the word people used and which in this case was accurate. He had been at ease with the direction of things for a long time before the end arrived, and the ease showed. Lenora sat with him through the last night, and Everett sat with her, outside the door, in the hallway, in the dark, the way he had learned to be present without requiring presence to be acknowledged. In the desk, alongside the ranch documents, Harlan had left a letter addressed to Lenora. The ranch to her, which was what she'd always known. The arrangement of various small things to various people who had earned them. For Everett, there was the one handwritten sentence on a separate slip of paper that had apparently been placed there some time ago because the paper had a quality of patience to it. A poor man counts what is missing. A good man learns what cannot be bought. Everett read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket beside the watch and went back to the kitchen where Lenora was sitting with a cup of coffee gone cold, not drinking it, staring at nothing in particular. He sat across from her. "He left me a sentence," he said. She looked up. He told her what it said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she pressed her mouth together in the way she did when something was too large for the room and she was deciding whether to let it be large or to manage it. "That sounds like him," she said. "It does." She pushed the cold coffee aside. She looked at him across the table with the red eyes and the steady posture of someone who is grieving and not hiding it, but is also, still underneath the grief, recognizably herself. "He was right about you," she said. Everett said nothing. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. They sat like that for a while. Time moved the way it does on working land. Not in dramatic arcs, but in seasons, each one bringing its own demands and its own small resolutions. The water issue with Black Mesa had settled permanently, and Silverhead Spring ran through 4 consecutive drought years without challenge. Sterling Rourke's name came up occasionally in county discussions, diminished each time until it stopped coming up much at all. The ranchers to the east renewed the grazing agreements. A young rancher 2 valleys over came to Everett asking about the rotation system, and Everett explained it the same way he'd learned everything useful in his life, by thinking through it plainly and saying it the same way. The young rancher implemented it. The following year, he came back with 2 more ranchers in tow. The Territorial Cattle Association asked Copper Willow to send a representative to the regional board. Lenora went the first time. The second time, she sent Everett, which surprised some members of the board and surprised Everett considerably less than it once would have. He still carried the watch. He still carried the folded slip of paper, though it had gone soft along its creases from being open and refolded more times than he'd counted. He did not look at it often. He didn't need to, after a while. The sentence had moved from the paper into somewhere that didn't require paper to remember. Some evenings, when the cattle had settled and the day was done and the work had reached its natural pause, Lenora came out to wherever he was finishing up. She did not make a production of it. She would simply appear at the fence, at the barn door, at the edge of the field, and fall into step beside him, or stand with him in the quiet, and they would watch the light change over the grass, which in October turned a particular copper gold that you only got in Wyoming at that hour. He thought on those evenings about the man who had arrived here 3 years before he married her. The man with the bedroll and the aging horse, and the letter that said he was honest and capable, which was true as far as it went and missed everything that mattered. He thought about the distance between that man and this one, and whether the distance was really distance at all or whether it was just the same man, finally in the right place, finally willing to believe that the right place was allowed to be his. He did not count what he didn't have. He had stopped doing that. What he had was this, a ranch he had helped make stronger, a community of ranchers he had helped make more resilient, a woman beside him who had never once needed him to rescue her and who had chosen him precisely because he had understood that from the beginning. The memory of an old man in a chair who had seen something in a cowboy that the cowboy couldn't see in himself and had been patient enough to wait for him to catch up, and the knowledge, earned the hard way, which is the only way it stays, that the things worth having are rarely the things you can count. They are the things you do at 4 a.m. when no one is watching. The miles you ride because it's right, not because it's required. The hand you take and the silence you keep and the work you show up for every day without demanding recognition for the showing up. Harlan's sentence was right. A poor man counts what is missing. Everett Shaw had been that man. He knew what that man felt like from the inside. The measuring, the deficit, the constant arithmetic of what he lacked against what others had. It was exhausting and it was wrong not because the math was incorrect, but because it was the wrong math entirely. A good man learns what cannot be bought. He had learned it slowly. He was still learning it on the honest days because, Learning that kind of thing is not a single moment, but a practice, the same way the work was a practice. You did it today, and then you did it again tomorrow, and the doing of it over time was the only thing that made it real. Lenora put her hand inside his. The grass moved. The sky did what Wyoming skies did in that hour, went wide and gold, and then a deeper color that had no single name, the kind of color that makes you feel the size of the world without making the world feel hostile. Copper Willow. Silverhead Spring running clear on the north side of the canyon, marked by 2 standing stakes and an empty cairn that had been left as it was, because the space where the missing post had been was its own kind of record now. Evidence of a thing attempted and failed, a reminder that removing evidence is not the same as removing truth, the hands finishing their work, the horses settling, the ordinary sounds of a place that was alive and would be alive again tomorrow. Everett Shaw stood in it all, not counting.